So good afternoon and welcome. Welcome friends, colleagues, attendees, everyone that is with us on this session. This is a gathering on race, racism, racialization in history with a focus on how to view these three terms that we are using from a long, broad history, but also with a focus in ethnic studies. The murder of George Floyd, 8 minutes and 46 seconds, captured on video, really have shook both the country and the world into realize and possibly come to a moment of the centrality of race and how race is intertwined with everything. You cannot escape race, and everything within our own society is still structured around it. And as we see, protesters are still in the streets. We want to celebrate actually the protesters, because without them, let us be very clear, the charges would not have come through, the arrest would have not come through, and the beginning of this major conversation has not occurred. So often is blaming the victim anew to try to actually shift the discussion and the conversation on these important issues. So this is a conversation, we have many participants, and I see it as just one step in the many steps that really have to take place for us to have a social justice-based understanding of how to confront race, racism, and racialization in our society. It's really, I wanna begin and get our conversation going by my dear friend, Troy Duster, Professor Troy Duster. He's been at it longer than any one of us, hailing from Chicago, but also was at really the leadership of the American Culture Program at UC Berkeley that began how to introduce conversation in the broader curriculum. And I really want him to lead us in this conversation and an open remark. His essay that was sent out by the American Culture Program is very important, and also he'll point to us a few other pieces, especially the New York Times piece, which I will also share with you on the chat. So Troy, please take it. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Hatim. Let me start with a point in history which most of you will know about, namely, it was the first televised video filmed projection of a beating. That was the Rodney King beating 29 years ago. And in that situation, what is now somewhat a feature of a forgotten history, I got a note from my colleague, Patricia Williams, and she said, Troy, let me remind you that in the Rodney King beating, there was a point when one of the policemen put his foot on Rodney King's neck while the beating was going on. Now, I point to that because I want to emphasize a sharp, interesting development in history, which has been going on for about 28 years, up until the George Floyd killing. And that is the following. When news media, news anchors, and reporters have reported on these series of televised video beatings by the police, the common thematic narrative has been, these are rogue cops, that these are bad apples, that of course police departments have these situations, but they are not common, they're very uncommon. And in the first trial in Los Angeles of the 4 who were accused of beating King, the rogue cop thematic was very much there. And even though that was the framing, those 4 officers were acquitted. It was only when the second trial occurred, where the government came in and said that Rodney King had been abridged of his civil and human rights, that's when 2 of the officers were convicted and then spent 2.5 years in prison. But for the last 28 years, up until the Floyd situation, the dominant framing of the problem has been bad apples, bad policing of particulars. And even this morning on NPR, I heard the chair of the Police Union Association describing what he called a need for reform. And the first thing he said was, we need to weed out bad cops. We need to have a situation in which we can have better screening programs. Despite that, what I've seen in the last, I would say, 6 to 8 weeks is a reframing that's new and I think very hopeful. And I think it's the emphasis of this webinar. What we're now seeing for the first time is almost every anchor of the news and all the reporters describing the systemic character of policing. You no longer hear the notion that these are a few bad cops. And I think part of the answer comes from the kind of data being produced, and you'll hear more about this from Hatim. This was the New York Times study of the Minneapolis Police Department and how it had acted quite differently in different jurisdictions in Minneapolis. What I want to do is, however, talk about, I think, did I just lose you? Okay, I can continue. Here it is here, right. The police using force against blacks 7 times the rate of whites. Okay. I want to add to that another frame, and that is, it is not that as though there are simply bad or good cops. It is that the self-same policeman who can be a servant of the people in one jurisdiction, tip his hat and be polite, that self-same policeman can act in a brutal way in a different part of the town. So I want you to engage me for just a minute in a thought experiment, and it's going to fail. Here's why. I just got through reading a book called Dark Towers. It's about banking fraud, ways in which Deutsche Bank and other banks have used derivatives and insider trading to have fraud. So imagine this experiment, that someone is accused, not of simply having a $20 counterfeit bill, but someone is accused of a $200,000 insider trading violation. And Officer Chauvin, the one who put his knee on the neck of George Floyd, Officer Chauvin goes to the bank, accuses, and with 3 other officers, takes this insider trading out to the car, pummels him, puts him down on the pavement, and puts his knee to his neck for 8 minutes. Now think about that. Officer Chauvin, in certain parts of Minneapolis, I'm sure it was polite and a servant of the people. But we cannot conceptualize a policeman dealing with insider trading or the ways in which the Deutsche Bank has for the last 14 years defrauded the constituents of over $140 billion. We can't even conceptualize a police activity that goes after those kinds of elements of our society. Let me just say one more thing about this framing, which I think is vital to our current circumstance, what I'll call the sudden reconceptualization of policing, away from bad cops and into systemic activity. Many of you will know that there's been a controversy with stop and frisk, especially in New York City in the last 2 decades. And in that work by my colleague and friend, Terry Levine, he documented how the police part of below 95th Street on the east side of New York, there were almost no stop and frisk for a full year. But above 95th Street, several thousand possession of marijuana. Levine's research indicated that, of course, there were people below 95th Street who were consuming marijuana. Indeed, his research published by later the ACLU, which I encourage you all to go to, just go to ACLU Stop and Frisk. And you'll see the extraordinary results that Blacks, Latinos, and whites in their teen years consume marijuana at about the same rate. But that in New York City, the arrest for Latino and Blacks was 6 to 7 times higher than for whites. Now, if you go back to the graphic which Hatim has put up, you see those rates in Minneapolis. What you are beginning to comprehend, and the nation is trying to comprehend, is that this is routinized. This is not roguery. These are not cops who are out of control. We needn't simply go into police departments and get the bad people. We need to reconceptualize the systemic character of policing, that in every major city in this country, we would find similar kinds of results. You see there on the graphic, 20% of the population is Black. 60% of the time, those arrest figures reflect systemic policing. One last remark about systematic issues, and it broadens our discussion away from the police. If you're watching television yesterday, you would have seen the results coming out of Georgia, and you would have seen what has become all too common, that in the major Black communities of Georgia, the lines for voting lasted, in some cases, people were in line for 3 and 4 hours, while in the white parts of Georgia, people simply walked in and within 10 minutes were able to vote. The same thing happened in Ohio in 2004, and then it's begun to happen increasingly as we see some parts of this society, mainly the Republican governors, try a systemic attempt to have voter suppression. Let me end there and open this discussion, and I'll try to get back to Hatim. The main thematic I want to begin with is the shifting zeitgeist, shift away from the idea of rogue cops, the shifting away from a situation in which it almost is accidental that these long lines at places to vote are primarily in the Black community. And we begin to have a discussion about how these systemic questions deserve systemic solutions. Hatim, back over to you.
Thank you. Maybe we'll open to some of our panelists to pose some questions and engage Troy. So I see some of the participants already online. So if you have any question to what Troy have put forth, please, by all means, ask the questions, and let's have a short conversation while we're waiting for Congresswoman Barbara Lee to join us.
Troy, I'd like to ask you a question about the upcoming election, and as you just talked about, the voting issues that you raise here. What can be done? What are some of the things that we can try to prevent? This kind of intimidation, this kind of disavowal of the right to vote. Do you have any advice to offer in that front?
Well, I think what's happening on the national level is the former Attorney General, Holder, and Barack Obama himself have been very much involved in trying to develop strategies, political strategies in various states to oppose this strategy of voter suppression. So my advice or my suggestion would be to link up with what Holder has been doing. He has a program in which he's invited a lot of politicians to join him in the effort to fight this systemic voter suppression strategy that's coming out of the Republican governors.
Harvey is asking the question on the chat: how did public views of anti-police brutality forces shift as well? It's more acceptable today than previous?
Again, I'm struck after watching for these last 3 decades how it's happened so quickly. It reminds me of what happened with gay marriage. Who would have thought even 15 years ago that would have been such a distinctive and developed notion that we would have gay marriage? Well, in the last year, certainly the last 3 or 4 months, the pandemic has done is to reveal the structures of systemic racism in ways that many of us have been publishing and talking about for years, but we suddenly are getting some traction with the media. So now when we talk about the pandemic began, you'll recall the language was something like this. The virus doesn't know any categories. No matter whether you're Black or white or Latino, whether you're young or old, the virus has no political agenda. Well, about 4 or 5 weeks ago, there was a shifting framework. And people began to say almost routinely, no, this pandemic is revealing systemic differences in access to healthcare. And that in conjunction with the George Floyd situation, the fact that we've begun to talk about systemic issues of race across healthcare and now policing conjoin. And I think that is what's happened, what we might call shifting zeitgeist. It's happened with the gay marriage about 15, 20 years ago. And I would say the last 4 months, the shift from we're all equal in terms of the virus to a new analysis of how this shows how the healthcare system tying your health insurance to employment is revealed as a fundamental flaw in the American system of healthcare.
One person is asking the question, should we trust politicians to be able to eradicate and solve the issue of racism?
Well, politicians are always the ones who jump ahead of the uprisings. That is, they rarely would lead them. But what happens is you have protests in the streets. And at that point, there's a real shift in the way in which politicians and others begin to talk about the issues. I mentioned police brutality. Politicians have known this for the last 30 years, or at least 30 years, that there's been police brutality. But now that there are protesters in the streets for 14 straight days on this issue, we're finding, of all things, on the front page of the New York Times this morning, the story about the Republican Congress having to now jump out and deal with policing brutality. This is a shock. It's not as though the politicians didn't know this was going on. What they didn't understand was the depth of what was going on with the reaction to the police brutality around George Floyd and the others of the last 4 or 5 months. That's what's new.
Any Sadiq, go ahead.
Thank you, Hatim. Thank you, Professor Duster. If you can elaborate a little bit more on our understanding of this spontaneous discuss of the police brutality against Black bodies, and how we as a society, and that's in relation to the previous questions, how we could set up the ground or lay the grounds for really systemic change, because that's what everybody asking, but it doesn't seem to me there is a way in which to harness this political energy toward a particular project that to deal with all issues that you mentioned, whether that public health or economic opportunities or education or police brutality. Thanks.
Well, all right. That's a very difficult question to answer because it has to do with deep systemic problems. And as I said in my opening remarks, once you reframe the issue as systemic, you have to have a systemic solution. Now let's take police brutality. As long as we kept talking about brutal cops, the only way that people talked about solutions was to have a screening program to screen out the brutal cops, or to have training programs which kept police from being more brutal. But as you know, those failed miserably. And the reason was because we have a situation of review of police activity, which has been internal to the police department. The police have been very successful in blunting most jurisdictions from having police review panels, which were external to the policing department itself. So if there's going to be a systemic change, to begin to answer the question, we would need to have a situation in which the reviews of policing behavior are not internal to the police, where jurisdictions, offices are given teeth, are given the capacity to fire, to punish, to convict those who are in violation. And even there, unless we could return back to the Minneapolis situation that was shown up on the screen, when you have the police policing only one part of the population, these stop and frisk or these activities about control, then we're going to have a continuation. In order for there to be a systemic change, there has to be something at the very top which mobilizes a different kind of policing. And that's what you're hearing now with this defund the police. It's the beginning. No one, I think, seriously believes that we're going to simply not have police. But the idea of defunding means that a new kind of funding would come with teeth and control that we have not seen so far. So the defunding framework is only about a week old, by the way, in terms of getting it across to the whole nation. Has potential of at least getting at the source of the kinds of systemic issues that we've been talking about. When it comes to healthcare, I take a deep breath because that's a much more massive undertaking. But I think what the pandemic has done, as I said earlier, what the pandemic has done is to reveal that if you tie health access to employment, and then you have 40 million people unemployed, you have a revelation of the deep, fragile character of our healthcare system. That's showing up everywhere.
There is a question, and I think this might be also, you started your career in journalism. So with the recent cancellation of TV shows, cops, do you think that Hollywood have shifted away from the glorification of the police? And then also maybe connected to that, what role does our current president play in perpetuating and pushing these systemic racism? So if you maybe...
Well, I claim no expertise on Hollywood and its or the New York capacity to put together films about celebration of the police. However, in response to your remark about the cancellation of cops, that is remarkable. 31 years of television programs which have focused upon the police perspective on policing. Now, even Law and Order and all the Law and Order films come at the issue of policing from the point of view of the police. I think if we began to have television programs centered in the Office of the Public Defender and call them not cop films, but actually justice films, we might begin to see something important shifting in our cognitive maps around what is involved when the police are coming to arrest.
Maybe we could take your time for one more question, if you don't mind, Troy. One person is saying, is it possible to see that the American system itself is deeply militarized? We see this abroad, but white privilege seems to extend to international realm as well as it possible to see here domestically in US culture. So the whole notion of militarizing the society.
Well, if I'm to take a ray of light or hope from the last 5 or 10 days, it is that the military officers have spoken up. It is the military who've said to Trump, no, we don't want to go down that road. Now that is extremely significant. Why? Because the military officers routinely refuse to take the public stage and to renounce what's happening in terms of what the White House is pushing, or the Congress. But we're at an interesting moment. I think the whole idea of defunding or rethinking funding for the military is still a ways off. I mean, if you look at the country's budget, the extraordinary amount of money that goes into the Defense Department and out there been discussed for the last 50 years, and it's only gotten bigger. So I don't think we're there with respect to reconceptualizing the budgetary problems of the military. What I do think has happened is that Trump's activities, his position on the military, has drawn attention to this matter. And it may come to backfire against the military itself in the same way that the last 15 days have backfired against policing of minority communities.
Great.
Okay, I'd like to continue, but I have, as I said, another commitment, so I'm going to have to leave the panel.
And if you recommend any essential reading, please send us. I will send everybody the New York Times article, and any essential reading that you'd recommend, we'll definitely include it and tag it as a PDF for everybody to see. Thank you, Troy, for your contribution.
Thank you.
Thank you. So still waiting for Congresswoman Barbara Lee. She said she's running 10 minutes late. So if I will shift right now, maybe to bring Perfecta to address the issue of implicit bias and policing and so on. So I'll turn, or again, so Perfecta, can you take and jump in a few minutes ahead of your spot?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. I'm very excited to engage. I'm a PhD student in public policy at UC Berkeley. I studied public policy and law enforcement. And my work has sort of centered on two areas. It's centered on the history of policing, particularly examining the ways that race and racialization have shaped policing practices. And then it's also, it's focused on community policing, and I'll say more about community policing in a minute. My current work looks at police and community contact. I'm doing a series of interviews with police officers and community. On the police side, I'm trying to get a sense of officer mindset when they engage in contact. I'm asking questions about contact experiences, officer role, safety, control, things like that. And on the community side, I'm asking questions about contact experiences as well. But what is the role of police in communities? What is the role of police in safety? What does safety mean without police? What are community-driven approaches to safety? Just try to get that aspect from the community side. So that's kind of like the work of my dissertation. I was going to talk a little bit about community policing, and then if folks have questions about implicit bias, I can try to answer those as well. So I started out looking at community policing, and I'm still interested in it, although my understanding of the impact of it has certainly shifted as I've continued to research the topic. It's really built on this principle of intergroup contact. Knowingly or unknowingly, all community policing programs, and they're vast in their number, are built on the concept of intergroup contact. And intergroup contact is this psychological theory that says under the right conditions, positive contact will reduce prejudice between groups. So basically the idea when you apply that to policing is you give police and community the opportunity to engage in positive contact. And the idea is that when that happens, then the relationship will improve. There's really no single community policing strategy. That's one of the issues with community policing, is that there's no real definition of it, but probably the best example or the most widely used example is coffee with a cop, right? Like this idea that you sit down with a police officer and you engage in a discussion, and maybe the police officer helps you with some things, and it's this opportunity for positive contact both ways. There's not a lot of evidence, I should say, to suggest that this actually improves police officer relationships with community, and certainly there's very little evidence to suggest that it improves behavior, officer behavior. that having said that, there is some research coming out of Camden, New Jersey, which dissolved its police department and then rebuilt it back up with a very strong community policing focus that is some evidence to show the positive effect of community policing if it's done at that level where you actually dissolve your police department. But I wanted to talk about sort of community policing just to be a little critical of it. I wanted to point out two things related to community policing that I think make it hard to be sort of a systemic solution to some of the issues that we're talking about here, you know, police violence and particularly violence against communities of color and particularly Black communities. So for one, you know, intergroup contact really is about positive contact and the effect of positive contact, but most policing contact is not positive. People are calling the police when they need something, and so even if police act in a completely just manner, that person who's called is in need of, and often in crisis. So they might have had their car broken into, they might have been robbed, they might have seen a family member experience a mental breakdown, and so they have still a negative experience of the encounter, right? Which makes it hard kind of in everyday policing to have a community policing strategy. And then I think what I think is most important in this situation, and I want to talk about a little bit, is that community policing often, at least as I've seen it, ignores the power dynamics of contact, and intergroup contact research in general has not done a good job of including the role of power and how power can impact the contact experience, right? So the intergroup contact is 70 years of research on intergroup contact. It's probably the most well-established theory in social psychology, but for most of that time, it ignored the role of power in contact between groups. I would say only in the last 15 years or so, it started to explore it in great detail. So we do have some information, and just based on what we know, I don't think community policing doesn't come out very well. From what we know from the research, that power differences in groups influence the types of contact that the groups want and their motivations for engaging in contact. So high power groups often, when engaging in contact, want to maintain the status quo. And so the contact that they want is contact that focuses on shared experiences or commonalities. Thinking back to Coffee with a Cop, it's that kind of, Coffee with a Cop is that kind of model, right? Where it doesn't in any way challenge the existing relationship between police and the community. It just sort of is an opportunity for there to be some kind of shared group experience. Low power groups, when they go into intergroup contact, they're often motivated by a desire to actually address the power disparities, right? That's the type of contact that they want. They want to talk about the power disparities, and they're motivated to engage in contact for those power disparities, to address those power disparities directly. We do know that contact that focuses on shared experiences and commonalities, it does create more positive intergroup attitudes. Like, people come out of that feeling better across groups, but that doesn't necessarily translate into changing behavior. And I want to just talk about, there's not a lot of research in this, but I want to talk about one example, which is
You froze on us. So.
the low power group got to assign credit. The low power group did not have. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I think the last piece did not come. So if you could just.
Okay.
Read
So it's this study where it's trying to test this idea of, do changes in attitudes translate into changes in action? And so they divided up participants in the study. It was done in the lab by psychology researchers. They randomly assigned them into either having high power or low power. The high power group was the group that assigned credits, that assigned reward for participation in this study. The low power group didn't get any ability to do that. And then they took these two different statuses and they randomly assigned them into groups to have a discussion either about commonalities, so we're all students, we're all in the psych department, that sort of thing, or differences, in this case to directly talk about, is it fair that some students get to assign the credit or not, right? And what they found from that is that the group who talked about common experiences, they did have improved attitudes, right? They came out of that feeling better about each other across group. But in that group where they talked about their commonalities, the group that had less power, they had an expectation that after that contact experience, that after that meeting, they were going to be treated fairly, that the high power group was going to assign credits equally because they had a positive experience and they felt like they were going to be treated fairly. But what the researchers found was that in both the group that talked about difference directly, that talked about the power disparities directly, where they did not have improved attitudes, sometimes worse attitudes, and the group where they talked about commonalities, in both of those groups, the high power group, the group that got to assign credits, assigned them exactly the same, which is to say that they assigned themselves more, that they did not, when they had the opportunity to engage in non-discriminatory behavior, it did not change their behavior, even though they had this positive experience. So what contact research are taking from this, and I think what we can take from this when we think about how intergroup contact applies to policing, is that just because we have positive contact experiences and just because we have improved attitudes, that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to see changes in discriminatory behavior. And I think that's really important when we're thinking about what kind of reforms that we're looking to implement in policing. So I'm going to kind of wrap up with, like, where does this leave us? And I think in sort of mirroring this discussion that's happening nationally right now, I sort of think about it as, like, do we do incremental reforms? Like, I think kind of the 8 can't wait, which are these 8 policy reforms that are strongly associated with reductions in police violence, or the radical reforms, right? Like the defunding of police. And from my perspective, I feel like both are necessary. I think if we're trying to fundamentally remake institutions and create systems where people thrive and have equal access and opportunity, like, we need to work at all levels, from inside and from out. But I do think there's a better opportunity, there's a better time to push incremental reforms versus revolutionary reforms. And I think, what we're seeing right now with millions of people in the street, in all 50 states, in like South Korea and South Africa and Brazil and Scotland and East Texas, there's a momentum towards this more radical reform. And I think now's the time to really push for big change. And I think that those big changes are possible, and I think that they would be really, really valuable to the institution of policing, because the institution of policing, if people have questions about this, I'm happy to ask. The institution of policing is very much rooted in different practices based on how groups have been racialized. Oh, I can't hear you.
Still waiting for Congresswoman Barbara Lee. We're texting back and forth, but I'm going to turn to Judge Trina Thompson. She's with us. She teaches in our institution. She teaches issues that are at the core of what we're dealing with, on issues of fairness, of peace, of justice, and how actually from the bench, how to think of these issues of a justice system that is anything but putting out justice for those who deserve it. So Trina, take us, please.
Thank you.
Thank you.
First of all, Hatim, thank you for putting this together. This has been an amazing panel, and it's timely, and it's nice to bring all of us together. It's rare that all of the professors and lecturers get a chance to work collaboratively. But I'm going to speak in a couple of different voices, and my main thrust of my comments are access to fairness and justice for peace. As a judge, I cannot do my job with integrity without the participation of members of the community, serving on juries, serving on grand juries, and being collaborative partners with our justice partners. We have a hard time getting people to serve on juries. And so when there's a disparate outcome, we're saying to ourselves, we're begging you to participate in jury service, and we look in the audience and we don't see you because you're either not showing up, or there may be an equity issue. And this is where those who draft legislation and those who are justice partners need to wrap their head around this. We have individuals where it's cost prohibitive for them to serve on a jury that lasts more than a couple of days. So if there isn't some funding for people to be able to at least meet their basic needs in order to serve, we're limited. Now, judges are subject to the canon of ethics, which means we are restricted or prohibited from commenting on pending cases or becoming involved in any political controversy. But we can talk about cultural competency, educational programs, and we're very much embedded in the community. I teach 2 courses, one in the Ethnic Studies Department, Racism and the Law, the historical perspective of people of color. That's a name that I inherited when I took over the course. It's a name that I would love to change, and one that talks more about diversity and inclusion. The second class I teach is in the Legal Studies Department, and it's Juvenile Justice, the Color of Law. And we go through everyone's diaspora. And one of the things that comes up in my class is that my students are saying, why am I just learning this history? Why do I have to be at the foot of the college door before I get this? Our children should not have to wait until they get to college to receive a culturally diverse education. Ethnic studies should be part of the curriculum beginning at elementary school because proximity matters. As these students begin to learn each other's diaspora, they begin to have empathy for one another, and they begin a very different dialogue. I've seen it year after year in my course. As they begin to merge their histories and begin to realize that a lot of the microaggressions that they're experiencing are embedded in the brokenness of a lot of the people that they're engaged with. And if they can meet people at their brokenness, that proximity changes the narrative. It changes the discussion. The same thing as you're talking about community policing. I think Perfecta did a very good job of trying to distill some of those issues. Professor Duster did a very good job of talking about, we're not going to get rid of the police. That's just not going to happen. I'm going to call 911 if somebody has a gun in my face. So let's be real about that. But we are talking about shifting the way we think about policing and maybe shifting the way we fund policing, because police officers right now are charged with doing things that they are not even trained for, dealing with mentally ill individuals where there should be crisis team engaging people in those circumstances, dealing with other matters of which, if they're not from those neighborhoods, they may not know how to navigate or negotiate a conversation. If we have more police officers who are from these communities and who actually know how to be cultural brokers and have a conversation and are embedded and involved in the community, you may see a different paradigm. You may see a paradigm shift. But there are also things we can do as educators. I hate to tell you, but our students watch how we engage with one another. They watch whether we are truly about inclusion and diversity. They look to see whether there are individuals who are gatekeepers and privileged, and then decide who gets the privilege of being able to have resource in order to teach the students what they need. There's a huge digital divide. I've been teaching this summer in the A session. I have students who are trying to watch their lectures on their phone. They don't have Wi-Fi capability. They don't have access to a lot of things. And I said, it's like running a race and everybody's on the track and you're putting all these barriers in front of people and expecting them to end the race at the same time. So there are things that I think we can do at every level, from being a community member, a professor, and someone engaged in the juvenile justice system, and someone more importantly engaged in the adult system. We do need jurors. When called, serve. Don't complain about an outcome if you're not willing to come and serve. If you feel that there are so many hardships and impediments in the way, talk to your legislators about how to change that. We have a system that we've been using since day one. Well, if you think that there needs to be changes, you need to look at it holistically. Do we have courthouses that are not accessible because of public transportation limitations, because of daycare issues, because of the scheduling of classes for minors who are going to school and their parents are called in to serve on juries. There are other impediments that keep this imbalance going. And so when we only inoculate or look at one issue, we're really not embracing all of the problems that we have. And some things we personally are empowered to change. I'm in a class where I have students who are of great affluence and who cannot relate to some of the experiences of their fellow students. And so I purposely put them in these group projects so that they do gain proximity. And at the end, we've had students who will give someone a book, make sure that they have Wi-Fi, that they have high def earplugs. I mean, it's amazing what happens when you have proximity. So I hope that I'm able to share some things. It's probably not what you wanted to hear. It probably isn't in the area that you wanted. But Hatim, if there's any direct questions that you have, and keeping in mind that judges cannot talk about pending or impending. When you see judges on television, my dear sister, LaDoris Cordell, who is just like killing it out there, she's retired. She's able to speak in all parameters. But those of us who are serving, we're neutrals. We have to remain that so that we can be there in order to be the gatekeepers of due process and justice. So are there any questions that you have in particular, or Perfecta, or any of our other co-panelists?
Let me shift. Congresswoman Barbara Lee have joined us by phone,
Great.
and she's already working. She's in the front line of the Congressional Black Caucus, and they've been working on issues of policing for quite some time. I've been working with Congresswoman Barbara Lee in the district for a long time, maybe 15 to 20 years. So it's really a pleasure to have you with us. So Congresswoman, take us, please.
Thank you so much. Glad to be with you. I think it's longer than 20 years at this point.
Yes.
Oh God, this is our lap of a marathon, and so I hope everyone understands this struggle didn't just start, and it's not ending tomorrow, but it'll end next week if we keep our eye on the prize, as Congressman John Lewis says. So I want to thank you for giving me the invitation to address you and be with you for a few minutes. And welcome to everyone who has tuned in on this webinar. And I must say, and I always have to say, how proud I am to represent this beautiful and resilient district. And so I'm so grateful to be able to be with you. I am in Washington, D.C. You know, we're doing our police bill and resisting and fighting this administration, and so I had to come here for a couple of days and to Mr. Floyd's beautiful funeral, but it was such a moment of transformation, I think, for the country and the world. And so I just want to thank UC Berkeley's Ethnic Studies Department for organizing this important conversation and for giving me a chance from DC to be with you. I want to recognize that all across the nation and across the globe, students, families, neighbors, and our communities are stepping up and voicing that Black Lives Matter. I remember several years ago, I asked Alicia Garza, one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, to come be my special guest at Barack Obama's final State of the Union speech. I wanted to help members of Congress understand what Black Lives Matter meant. And her presence and talking with members then really inspired them, even though they were not saying Black Lives Matter, but now they are. And so just know we've made progress. And during these very difficult and tense times, it's really important for those of us who are African Americans to see and hear others saying Black Lives Matter and lifting up our lives also. So thank you so much. And we've got to make sure that we ensure keeping our mental and physical health safe. And so please continue with physical distancing and following the health protocols. This coronavirus is here and it hasn't gone away. And I'm a little concerned that people are getting a little too relaxed. So please know that we have to follow the health protocols and do what needs to be done to keep our communities and of course your families and yourselves physically healthy. Let me acknowledge all the speakers today and our panelists and all of the work that you've been doing, and thank you for fighting for a more just society by speaking out and educating all of us. Our communities are rightfully angry. Some are tired, but as a Black woman, I have to say I ain't no way tired. You know, this is our time to fight and to run this lap of this marathon. And so you're still in this fight, and you're here to educate yourself and challenge each other. As Nelson Mandela said, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. We must examine and understand the underlying issues of systemic and institutional racism that is broader than police reform, but also addresses racism at every level, including education, immigration, housing, criminal justice, foreign affairs, you know, healthcare, everywhere. And so I think this is a moment for truth-telling. So many countries around the world have put together truth and reconciliation commissions. This country never has. And so I have introduced the formation of a Truth, Racial Healing Transformation Commission and take the rightful steps towards permanently eliminating persistent racial inequality. But we have to understand that the 400 years ago, the 401 years ago now, the first enslaved persons were brought to these shores. And we have never confronted those human rights brutal violations that lasted over 250 years. And the legacy of slavery still haunts us today, and people don't understand sometimes what systemic racism is. So that's why we put together this commission, to talk about and to make the public aware of the historical context of police murders, for example, or of the disproportionate rates of COVID-19 as it relates to African Americans, or why you see the largest percentage of homeless and unsheltered people, African Americans. They don't connect the historical context of slavery and the truth about Jim Crow, slavery, lynching, segregation, all of the brutalities that have taken place that have been systematized and institutionalized in our policies. And so this commission is about putting together truth, a truth-telling body, so that we can move then toward unity and some healing that must happen in this country, and then transformation. We've got to transform this society. And we decided not to call it reconciliation, which many countries, I think South Africa used reconciliation, and so did Rwanda in terms of truth and reconciliation. But we're saying transformation because there's really nothing to reconcile in America. When you look at the genocide of Native people, when you look at the Chinese Exclusion Act, Japanese internment, when you look at, of course, slavery, you know, there's not a lot to reconcile. And so we want to confront these errors, these brutal human rights attacks and assaults and moments throughout our history so that we can move forward. So we have to build on what our forefathers and mothers fought for, and what our civil rights leaders have fought for, and our human rights leaders, young people, Selma. When you look at the civil rights movement, these were young people, these were students, these were high school and college students who led. And so once again, the young people are leading, and we have to listen and we have to learn, and then we have to advocate and speak out. So I can't express enough how proud I am that you are doing this. I'm so proud of our students at Cal. Of course, I'm a Go Bears person. I spent 2 years in the School of Social Work. I am an MSW from Haviland Hall. So Cal has a special place in my life and in my heart. I want to thank you again for taking all of the health precautions to prevent the spreading of this virus. We're in this together, and everyone has an important role to play, not only in this pandemic, but also in the pandemic within the pandemic, and fighting for Black lives, because Black lives do matter. So thank you again. Thank you for having this very meaningful conversation. And our team, keep speaking up, keep speaking out. Thank you so much for your leadership.
Thank you, Congresswoman, and we'll stay in contact. Thanks for coming and giving us an update and really pushing us forward.
Oh yeah, my district leads, and the university has always been that shining light in my district to push the country in the correct direction. So thank you again.
Thank you. So we'll shift right now. We have time for the question and discussion with both Perfecta and Trina, I know that you have limited time, so there's few questions. If you look at the Q&A, there's a few questions on policing that we could have, but from, at least from the justice system, at least from a judge perspective, what are some of the trainings and programs that we need to do academically that would begin to look and really prepare people in the broader sense to both challenge as well as to educate our communities in how both how the system works and how to challenge the system to change?
Well, one of the things I've done in my course is, as we go through each segment, is I have someone from the community to come in, and sometimes we push it a little bit. We have prosecutors who come in who are multi-ethnic, and they talk about why it's important to take on those roles that traditionally we tell people, oh, wait a minute, if you're in this role, you're not about community. But if we don't have people at the table, we're on the menu. So the only way you're going to cause systemic change is if, in fact, we are willing to be at every single table and have our voice heard. Now, I'm not going to say it's easy. I am at a lot of tables where people roll their eyes, suck their teeth, don't want me to open my mouth, and I look to my right and my left, and I may be the only one in the room. I don't want to be the only one in the room anymore. I would love to see more of our young people pursuing these careers. But just like me, when I came to Cal, I came from a very humble background. There were no judges in my family. There were no lawyers. I was the first to go to college, did not know anything about all of the different impediments that were going to be placed in front of me. But I was very fortunate in my education at Cal that there were members of the community who came back on campus in the African American Studies Department, in the Ethnic Studies Department, and people like Professor Roy Thomas made sure we had access to a lot of people in the community. Attorney Howard Moore, I was his GSI when he was teaching. And so that was where I learned a lot of the business acumen as well as the legal acumen that I needed to be able to be bilingual in the legal justice system, to be able to serve my clients well, but also to be when I got into the courtroom. So I think that there are resources available. I have begged to be at certain tables and been excluded. And I'm thinking, I'm a judge and pretty resourceful, and I can't get at tables at UC Berkeley. I can't get at tables to have a discussion. I'm teaching courses that have content that should qualify under American cultures in each department, but there are hurdles and hoops. And I tell the students, guess what? We're going to empower you. You feel like you've earned this part of the course, you have to go and petition, and you have to ask your advisors to give that designation. And so we start to teach them how to empower themselves, but we also make sure we have every power broker come into that class and talk about what it really is like to have boots on the ground. You know, it's easy to have a criticism, but in this class, these students have to also come up with solutions. And through this, I think we've seen some pretty remarkable outcomes. Students are working at the Ninth Circuit, they're working at the Supreme Court, they're working at races, they're in the community. So we know this recipe works, but we don't know how to make it broader. And we'd love to be able to do that because there are people who are willing to come back. Cal has a strong alumni that's working locally, and they're just trying to find a way to be supportive.
Perfecto. Did you look at some of the questions in the Q&A? There was a long
I can see a couple of them, but I can't see all of them. For some reason, it kind of abbreviates it for me. So if you want to throw out one, I see one that says, can you talk about the work of the criminal school at UC Berkeley and why it was shut down? I don't have an answer for that in particular. That's a question for Dean Chermaninsky. But I do know clinicals are very difficult to finance. You have to, if you're a lecturer, you have a full-time job as well. So today, in order to participate in this, my day started at 4:30 in the morning. I had to get all of my case law stuff done ahead of time. I attended some meetings, and I made sure that I had all of my orders done, but I also teach tonight starting at 5. So those of us who have multi demands on us, to then have to be in charge of fundraising in order to keep a clinical going, that is just not something we have the time and be good at the jobs that we do during the day and be accessible to our students. So it's a funding issue most of the time.
I think that's an area that we have to really do some, if you talk about systematic, we have to do some systematic work on curriculum, on programming. We are still in a not predominantly, we're in a Eurocentric institution that all of our curriculum is basically targeted toward creating replacement part for the economy. And as such, diversity, ethnic studies, all those courses that actually changed life and changed community and society, those gets to be at the short end of the stick or at the back burner. But hopefully this moment can be another moment for us to rethink some of the main areas of the university.
I think so. I mean, we all know the term publish or perish, we know that, but those of us who are lecturers, that isn't the driving force of what we're doing. So people who are in things like clinics where students actually finally get some hands-on, but more importantly, they get the mentoring that they're looking for. Students who come from affluent families, they don't have to look for a mentor. They've been talking about this stuff at the dinner table every night. But for students who are just entering into these professions, clinicals are exceptionally important. Having lecturers with real life experience who are not necessarily going through the academia side of it only, but actually can say, this is what it looks like, boots on the ground in the application process, it makes a huge difference because all of our students aren't going to go to grad school. Many of them are going to leave Cal and go straight into the workforce. And if we're not preparing them for the reality of what they're going to experience, they're going to be traumatized again. Because I have many students that come in my office that I have to navigate food insecurity, housing insecurity, personal insecurity, you know, and then we can finally get to the hard class material. So there's layers, and I think that you guys should really think about having a conversation with the leadership at UC Berkeley and having a dialogue. Do we really have a commitment to diversity? Do we really have a commitment to inclusion? And what does that look like? So I see there's another question. So do you want to read the question that you want me to answer? Because I can see there's another one.
You could answer the last question, and then I'm going to give Perfecta some time to answer. I'm cognizant of your time. You said till 4 o'clock.
That's right.
So this last question, based on my experience, this is a person saying so many people are incarcerated not because of the jury. They don't even make it to court because of the current laws that practically force people to take a plea bargain. What can we do to change these draconian laws? Correct me if I'm wrong, I think 92% of the cases end up in a plea bargain, and many of those African Americans that get railroaded through the legal system. So we have the best law, we have the best justice system that money can buy, and therefore how to begin to address that?
Well, it's deeper than that. For example, when I was the presiding judge of the juvenile court, there was a community that had kind of a diversionary community setup where if a child got in trouble, they didn't go to juvenile hall, they didn't go to the police department. The police department brought them to this community forum where there was almost a restorative practice of sorts. And they talked about, oh, this is Johnny. Johnny is acting out because his parents are traveling and he wants somebody to be home and so on and so forth. And then they work it out. In the more marginalized communities, one, a lot of kids do a lot of things and they're all doing the same things, but some kids have a house in order to protect themselves from being seen. Other children do not have that protection. So a lot of it starts at the ground level. When we get to court, there are a number of cases that come in. People are in custody, they're out of custody, they have a job they don't want to lose, they can't keep coming to court. And the attorneys will come in and they'll come in and negotiate. The judge does not participate in the plea bargain. People think the judge is in there, making the sausage. They're not, because there's even rules that say you can't reach over the bench into the bar and start telling people how to do their job. They're bringing the information to you, and you either adopt the negotiation or you reject it and the person goes to trial. But here's that first comment that I made. People are saying, I'm not going to trial because I saw what happened to Pookie and them. They went to trial and there was nobody in the audience that looked like any of them. There was nobody in the jury pool that looked like them. There was nobody in the jury box. So we can't criticize a system that we're not willing to participate in. And I can't say it enough. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So the plea bargaining happens for a number of reasons. And I really encourage people when COVID is over, because now COVID has changed the game significantly. When COVID is over, the courtrooms are open forums. Come in and watch a hearing and get real perspective on what actually goes on in a courtroom. Those who have come in and observed, they are far more empowered when they're going back to their communities about what really needs to happen. And it really starts at the ground level at school. That's where we can do our best work. And that was why at night I leave the bench and come on campus, because I recognize that that's where I can do my best work. So thank you for having me. I'm gonna leave because I've got to go back to being a judge and then starting up again as a professor. So thank you.
Thank you, Trina. Bless you for all your work, and we'll continue the conversation.
All right, bye.
Bye. Perfecta, there's few questions about policing, so if you could jump onto those questions if you can.
Okay, unmute. Yeah. So I think the first one was about what about funding social workers, education transformation, restorative justice, to abolish rather than reform. Yeah, I mean, I think that, like I said, there's these sort of two, I hate binaries, but here goes, like reformist and I guess they're both reform, like one sort of radical reform, and I put that under abolition, where as other people have said, as I've experienced abolition, and I'm no expert, I know that there are people at the Othering and Belonging Institute and a lot of folks on Berkeley who are experts, but every time I've ever read about it or heard somebody speak about it, it's always paired with like divest in policing, invest in programs that address the social determinants of crime. So poverty, homelessness, mental health and substance abuse, things like that. And that I sort of think of as a radical reform, right? Because we're not we might be dynamiting policing to the ground, but not really. There's still somebody who's going to call when there's violence, right? I just read an article by the ACLU director on policing, and she had this thing where 10 million police interactions every year, 5% of those are for the worst, like assault, rape, murder, assault with a deadly weapon, those sorts of things. So you could fundamentally reduce the institution of policing and redirect those funds. And I think that's what folks are talking about when they're talking about abolition, but there's still some kind of reimagined response to a critical emergency, because even we can imagine situations even when you have communities that are given what they needed to thrive, that you might still have violent crime, right? I don't know that we know how to eliminate violent crime and totally, but I think that the goals are the same, right? With reform and abolition is to ultimately get to a place where you have communities that don't need this type of police. And, I think a lot of police officers will say it themselves, right? Like they're responding to things that they don't need to respond to. I did a series of ride-alongs with the Oakland Police Department last year. I did about 12 of them. They go to all sorts of things they don't need to be there for. And they know it because they're going to them all the time. But when you call 911, that's who responds. So I think as researchers, as people where I sit, like one of the work that I try to do is, what is an alternative to that 911 phone call, right? Are there other things that we could be doing so that, it's not just the police that respond type of thing. And then there's another question about, that's kind of the same, I think, policeman that needs to be a mental health worker, family counselor. Yeah, I think that, police officers, they do a lot. And I think, policing is harmful to communities. It's harmful to cops. The number one killer of police is suicide. So this is an institution that's just failing a lot of people. And so I think that we do put way too much on police, and they're asked to do incredibly intense, horrible things. I mean, there was an incident in Oakland when I was doing ride-alongs where a 4-year-old boy found a gun and shot himself. And the police officers, every police officer who responded to that had to go to this mandatory trauma training. But basically, they went to that incident. They had a 4-year-old boy who lived, and then they have to go to another call, and in Oakland, there's a call, they average a call a minute all year long. Like they're nonstop responding to calls, and it's traumatic and it's draining. And that's from the person who holds all the power, So the way that the institution is set up, I think it fundamentally needs reform. And I think we're seeing that now. And I think that there's a lot of people who've done a lot of work, and whether it's sort of incremental reforms like enacting these policy solutions to address police violence, or whether it's the radical reform, which is like defund on a mass level and shift to community programs that uplift the community. I think all of that's needed, because the institution itself is so rooted in the like fundamental inequalities that shaped American institutions broadly, whether we're talking about policing or our capitalist systems, or these roots of inequality and white supremacy and patriarchy, and imperialism, they're all there, and I think policing is just where we're seeing it now, because there's just this violence that's happening over and over again, and people are responding to that.
Okay. Thank you, Perfecta. And if you have any recommendation for some pieces that we could send to everybody, by all means, send it to us.
Okay,
thank
definitely.
you for your work and your research, and look forward to reading the thesis once it's completed. Thank you. So let me shift right now to Professor Juana Maria Rodriguez. She is our chair of ethnic studies, and focus maybe on the international anti-Blackness in Latin America. So it's not only looking in the local, but also looking at transnational. So please take us through it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Hatem. And like everyone else, I want to thank you for organizing this so quickly, and for everyone who's here with us listening today. So yes, I mean, I really wanted to speak when you put out the call, the history of race, racism, and racialization. And I want to sort of start by sort of saying that institutionally, even though African American studies at Berkeley and ethnic studies are and have always been actually two separate departments, the legacies of slavery, the struggles of African diasporic people, and the realities of anti-Blackness, both historically and in the current moment, are really core to the work that we do in ethnic studies. And also Black people and those with African ancestry exist in Native American communities, exist in Asian communities, exist in Muslim communities, exist certainly in Latinx communities. So we need to sort of begin by acknowledging that Black people already sort of form part of the communities that we study when we study ethnic studies. Thinking specifically about Blackness in Latin America, I always tell students that there are more African Americans in South America than there are in North America. And so when we think of a category like Latinx, Latinx is already a category that has been, is seeped in Blackness. when we think about geography, it's kind of funny, you know, countries like Belize, Suriname, Guyana, Panama, even Brazil, very often simply fall out of what's imagined to be Latino or Latinx. And that very sort of failure of imagination is anti-Blackness, right? The fact that we don't even recognize that these countries form part of Latin America. So I think that's, you know, something that we kind of need to sort of contend with. Slavery existed in Mexico, it existed in El Salvador, it existed in Colombia and Peru, throughout Latin America. And it was just as vicious, just as inhumane, just as cruel as anything that we witnessed in the United States, and sometimes much more so. In Cuba, the life expectancy of a slave was 7 years, which means if you arrived as a slave at 14, you could expect to be dead by 21. Literally, you would be worked to death. So Latin America is also home to the first sort of community of free Blacks. In 1608, Gaspar Yanga, who was an enslaved African from what is now Gabon, led a slave rebellion and established the first all-Black autonomous community in the Americas that was called Lorenzo de los Negros. Today it's called Yanga. So I think, you know, knowing your history really means recognizing the millions of Afro-Latinx people throughout the Americas. But I want to say, if you're Latinx, this is your history. And you should know the history of slavery where your people are from. And I think learning that history is, in fact, the first step to really thinking about addressing anti-Blackness. Knowing that history, though, also means sort of coming to terms with its significance. And very often that means coming to terms with anti-Blackness within our own non-Black communities of color. History's messy. And so as much as we would like to divide students between oppressors and oppressed, right? It would be so great to just be able to point to people and say, that's the oppressor. In practice and in history, we know things are much more complicated. What do we do with the fact that many Native American tribes held slaves? The Cherokees, the other 5 civilized tribes, were really quite invested in the slave trade. We also know that African Americans fought in the Indian Wars, right? So again, these are not these kind of clean cut histories. And actually returning back to who I mentioned, Gaspar Yanga, right? Mexico declared him a national hero, but as part of the settlement of that town, he signed an agreement promising to return runaway slaves, right? So again, sometimes heroes are hard to find. History's complicated, it's messy. So even as so much of what we study in ethnic studies is about understanding European conquest and colonialism and how that has sort of shaped race and racism in this country, when we don't attend to those more complicated histories, I think it becomes easier to imagine that racism or anti-Blackness is something that exists elsewhere, that it's something that isn't part of our communities. And that's what, that's the message that I'd really like to sort of get us to think about a little more. We can certainly see this if you turn on Spanish language media and you see who the anchors are and who's brought in as experts. We can also see it in someone like George Zimmerman, George Zimmerman, who shot Trayvon Martin, right? Who is Peruvian. Apparently, when I was sort of looking this up, his mother's mother was Afro-Peruvian, right? So the idea that somehow people of being a person of color or identifying as a person of color inoculates you from forms of racism is just simply not true. We can also think about all the ways in which very often assimilating into American culture, part of what you know, we do and what our families did as immigrants to this country is assimilate into forms of anti-Blackness. So we can't really say, oh, our home countries were just fine. People got racist when they got here. No, we really have to do sort of better than that. I think, last year there was this fabulous conference on kind of comparative Blackness between Brazil and the United States. And so very, part of why we're seeing this worldwide turning out is because people around the world, in Europe, in Brazil, everywhere, are really coming to grips with all the ways in which anti-Blackness lives in these disparate places. So I guess I really would challenge people to start thinking about those histories and start having some really difficult conversations with your grandmother, who might say something, oh yes, they're in Spanish it's like, they're nice even if they're Black, they're good looking, or even if, right, these kind of qualifying statements, those are anti-Blackness, right? And that's how it lives. Someone was talking about language. This is how it lives in language. And so yes, you need to sort of speak back to your grandmother. You need to speak back when you're at that kitchen table and you hear comments that that really don't make those connections. So like I say, these are difficult conversations, but I think for those of us that identify as people of color but are not Black, we have to really do that work to challenge ourselves and the communities we belong to. Immigration, we know everything that's happening at the border right now. Everything that's happening around immigration also impacts Black people. Every single movement, right, has these elements where we really need to think through in these complex ways the effects of white supremacy and anti-Blackness. So, thank you.
Thank you. And we'll get into some questions as we shift to our next speaker is Loc Sui, Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies. The letter or the statement that came out from the department really spoke to the broader issues that we're dealing with, and it's very important conversation. Now we're gonna make a link to the yellow peril and the anti-Asian racism that also reared its ugly head just as the COVID-19, but has a long, long delay in our history. So please take us to the next step.
Yes. Thank you, Hatem, for organizing this very timely and important discussion. And there's a lot for all of us to learn, in this current moment, and a lot of us to be engaged, with these issues and in actions of transformation, hopefully. I do want to note, before I jump into the nuts and bolts of my discussion, is that there's a long history of solidarity between Asian Americans and the Black community. And I think just to highlight, the people like Yuri Kochiyama and Grace Lee Boggs, were two prominent individuals, who worked very closely and all through their lives, for Black liberation and also for Asian American movements. And I think those are very much intertwined. Asian Americans have to acknowledge the fact that we have benefited greatly from the victories, of the Black social movements and their struggles for liberation. I mean, we've really gained a lot, in terms of what we've learned, what we've gained from their struggles, and the changes in policy, the changes in opinions, and things like that. So it really is, the leadership and the sacrifices of the Black community that the Asian American community also owes, a bit of thanks to and gratitude to. So I think also as Asian Americans, we have to acknowledge that we're also thoroughly implicated and complicit, in the system of racism that we live in, and we're not immune to it, right? We're all sort of saturated in it in our everyday lives. So I do want to acknowledge that it's not lost on any of us, that one of the officers involved, is Hmong American, an Asian American, in the murder of George Floyd. And there's certainly a lot of work that we have to do within our own communities to educate ourselves, about that history of racism, and to really work against, collectively, against fighting white supremacy. I also want to say that media tends to isolate certain incidents and highlight one issue at a time. And I do want us to pay close attention to the multiple unrelated issues that we are facing. Certainly, right in front of us is the anti-Blackness, police brutality, everything that's wrong with the criminal justice system. And of course, the disproportionate effect that the COVID-19 has had on the African American and Latinx communities. It's also, we need to, I think, juggle alongside these issues is the detention centers at the border at this moment, and that there's a lot of deportation that is happening under the radar, and the wall continues to be built, on the southern border. And alongside with it, we mustn't forget the pandemic and the uptake in the violence against Asians. So I do want to take the remainder of my time to speak directly about the anti-Asian violence. And I know that many of us link the rise in anti-Asian violence to what Trump has coined the Chinese virus, but I do want us to step back a little bit and to frame it in relationship to two frames, and this is anti-Asian violence that's not just happening in the US, but it's happening in Europe, Canada, Australia, basically, where white settler colonialism has really taken place, But, the two frames that I want us to broaden this notion of the pandemic and the anti-Asian violence is, one, the current ongoing anti-China campaign that Trump has undertaken since he stepped into office. This is something that he ran on as part of his platform, and that he is continuing to do, and I want to come back to that issue in a minute. And the second part is the much longer history of the racist ideology of the yellow peril. So those are the two frames, both in the current moment, but also in relationship to the longer one. And I have to say that the potency of this violence, this animosity, this fear and anxiety around Asians in the US really taps into both those reservoirs, I think, of sort of affective fear, affective hate. So just looking at the near, present frame, I guess, the US-China trade war, we mustn't forget that, in 2018, when Trump began to really hold China responsible for the trade deficits, he initiated a number of tariffs, and trade barriers against China. And, it was news article after news article, policy after policy, tariff after, this is back and forth kind of battling, between China and the US around trade issues. And I think that is part of the backdrop, that is being filtered through the anti-Chinese violence that's erupted because of the pandemic. The other thing also, and shortly after that in 2019, the Trump administration also took on a very active and pervasive role in cracking down Chinese American scientists. And the idea of the intellectual theft, that is being made by China via these Chinese American scientists and researchers, in whether it is the biological sciences or in other kinds of military defense sciences. So, I mean, don't forget, that not too long ago, the Wenho Lee case is brought up, as someone who was arrested, who was he was actually settled. He had a settled case where they just weren't able to find any real wrongdoing on his part. So I think those are the two aspects that are really, in the backdrop just before the pandemic hit. And I just want to say that with the scientists, the Chinese American scientists, and the question of intellectual theft, of possible espionage, etc., the FBI was incredibly involved in creating this whole discourse around this, whole of society approach, that he has accused China of taking on. And this whole of society approach is this notion that anybody of Chinese American descent, whether you are an American citizen or not, whether you are a researcher, an executive, a technology worker, a student, anybody, is a possible subject, for acting as an agent on behalf of the Chinese state. So I think that there's a lot of danger in that kind of discourse, that's going on in this current moment, that we probably will see resurfacing in the next few years. The other lens, shifting really quickly, I know I'm running out of time, I'm mindful of that, Hatem, is really quickly the issue of yellow peril. And I think most of us have a good handle on the yellow peril, but just to say that yellow peril has been with us for a long time. It is the fear of racist ideology that expresses the fear of the rise of the yellow race, right? AKA the East Asians, that threatens Western civilization and Western global hegemony. And it's deeply embedded in white European and American, the psyche, as well as our social imaginary. And, one can locate that even the sentiments and ideas of yellow peril goes all the way back to the Genghis Khan era, the Mongolian Empire, the Mongolian invasion of Europe. But the more recent modern history, of yellow peril really comes out in the late 19th century, the late 1800s, with the notion of Chinese as competitive laborers, that are taking over jobs of white Americans. And the Chinese as a carrier of disease, which is really goes back, that far back. Where in San Francisco and in Los Angeles, the work of Nine Shan, Natalia Molina have shown that Asians have been characterized as disease carriers, and that they are a threat to the public health of Americans. And those two incidents together really were critical. The question of labor, the question of Asians as being, Chinese as being a disease carrier and threat to public health really was fundamental to shaping the Chinese Exclusion Act, and forwarding the series of Chinese Exclusion Acts. And, I think that comes up, it rears its ugly head over and over again. Yellow peril, the images of Fu Manchu is forever imprinted in our minds, through the fiction novels of Sax Rohmer and the films around Fu Manchu. Many of you can look that up as well. And, it transformed, to a fear against the Chinese in the late 19th century to a fear of Japan. And, and here you have the rise of Japan in the global economy and also its military up to World War II. And this is where you see it, the yellow peril being used against the Japanese American people in the incarceration of over 120,000 Japanese American men, women, and children into these camps. And then, you see it reemerging in the 1980s. And now, in the recent, 21st century against the Chinese again. So I do want us to keep in mind, I'm going to wrap it up by saying that it's the processes of treatment of ethnic Asians in the US is really intertwined with the geopolitical relations between US and the specific Asian countries. And while the targets move, you know, and shift, whether it's Japan, China, back to Japan, back to China, what you have is the ethnic Asians, racialized Asians in the US are seen as unassimilable. They're portrayed as forever disloyal, inability, you know, to become trusted with US citizenship and full belonging. And this is the question that is forever plaguing Asian American communities. And this is something that we need to continually see this bifocal lens of what happens in the US, what happens in the geopolitics. So that's it.
Thank you. And it just reminds me of the clash of civilization that is at the core of the geopolitics, the threat of the Chinese and the Muslims as undermining Western civilization. Well, we'll move quickly to our next speaker, and we'll still have some time for discussion, so just hold on. Rashida Shabazz, the PhD student. He worked on the Oscar Grant movement. And for those who are not familiar, it's a local case here in Oakland, so we don't need to go to Minneapolis. Many of us that are aware of police violence and brutality can relate to it. So it's really a pleasure to have you, Rashid, with us. So please take it.
Thank you, Professor. Assalamu alaikum. And peace be with you all. My name is Rashid Shabazz, and I'm a master's student in city planning at Dow, and I'm Oscar Grant. I'm a student of the Oscar Grant movement, and with the recent murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor has brought this issue of police terror back to the forefront. And so today what I want to talk about and focus on are some of the goals and strategies of a couple organizations that were involved in that movement. So thinking back to 2018, 2008, I remember election night and people being gathered in the streets of Oakland and really across the globe. And there was this really celebratory mood with Barack Obama becoming the next president. And for those who've forgotten the reign of George Bush, the two wars, the market crash, the foreclosure crisis, and the Great Recession, for many people, it was a time for celebration. People had hope that there might be change. But at the same time, you know, we saw corporations and institutions looting Black communities, the mass dispossession of wealth through taking homes through the foreclosure crisis, predominantly impacting Black and brown homes. And in the city of Oakland in particular, we saw these large corporations that were taking these homes and sitting on them, keeping them vacant. And for folks that followed the monster housing movement, that was really almost 12 years later, continuation of that. I want to quickly highlight the importance of place. As part of the context, I want to briefly share. This went down in Oakland. Oscar Grant was murdered in Oakland. He was a 22-year-old Black father, a worker, a butcher, and he lived in Hayward at the time, and he was on his way home from San Francisco for New Year's Eve. And so with Oakland, it's also the city, the home, birthplace of the Black Panther Party. And so even before the murder of Oscar Grant, there were the murders of Lil Bobby Hutton and Melvin Black, and residents had long called for an end to police terror. If folks are familiar with the Black Panther Party, their platform called for an immediate end to police brutality and murder of Black people. And so I just want to highlight that briefly before I talk about New Year's Day, 2009. And on that day, a white police officer named Bart, a police officer with Bart named Johannes Meserly responded to a call of a fight and came to the Fruitvale station, where within minutes of arriving on the platform with his partner, Tony Peroni, and others, he shot Oscar Grant in his back while Oscar was laying on his stomach. And the video, initially, Bart attempted to cover it up, and they confiscated cell phones of passengers on the train and on the platform, but they couldn't stop it and they couldn't stop the movement. The passengers uploaded videos to YouTube. It later came to KTVU, and ultimately it sparked a movement, starting with a rebellion. If you want to have a visceral experience of this, you may choose to watch the video again. I've seen it too many times, and seeing George Floyd is like seeing it all over again. And you can also watch the movie Fruitvale Station. And I want to really just pick up where that film left off. In her book, No Doubt, The Murders of Oscar Grant, and author and journalist Tandi Siswe Chimaranga, she writes that Oscar Grant was murdered 3 times. First by the police, then by the courts and by the media. And so I encourage folks to read that book. She details how the police, first Gary G said that the video was inconclusive, how the media amplified the theory that Messerly was reaching, that he thought Grant was reaching for a gun. And the reports from media emphasized Grant's status as a returning citizen, someone who had dealt with the criminal justice system, and somehow suggesting he was responsible for his own death. And so finally, the attorneys, they realized that they could say that Messerly he meant to reach for his taser, and that could be a better defense. And so ultimately, the case ended up being moved from the Bay to LA. And so I start off with that just to give some of that context, but I really want to focus on some of the goals and strategies of a couple organizations, and 2 in particular. CAPE, which was the Coalition for Police Against Police Executions, and No Justice, No BART. And so CAPE was, again, called the Coalition Against Police Executions, and they organized these massive protests that happened in Oakland in January in 2009. And their demands included the arrest, indictment, and prosecution of Messerly, the officer, the release of the names of the other officers that were on the platform, as well as a public review of BART to see if it was necessary or if they even needed to have guns. And finally, community restitution by, quote, funding community-based healing centers throughout Oakland for grief counseling, conflict resolution, and healing. That group ultimately disbanded in March 2009. So it was short-lived, but I think some of that work has lived on in a lot of ways. The second formation was called No Justice, No BART. And this was a direct action group, and their primary demand was to disband the BART police. Their call was the BART board must abolish the BART police, fully divest BART of any police power over the communities it serves. They had 7 demands. It was prosecution and conviction of Messerly, an independent investigation, suspension of all the officers involved, and fired 3 employees they understood as being a part of the cover-up: Officer Tony Peroni, Chief Gary G, and also the general manager of BART, Dorothy Duggar. G and Dorothy Duggar were both allowed to retire. Tony Peroni was fired, but he was later rehired. And then the final 3 demands: economic development for youth and youth programs to repair relationships of communities of color, drop the charges against the protesters that had been arrested during the mobilizations, and having Tom Orloff, who was then the district attorney, have him resign. And so again, their strategies included disruptions and protests at BART Station. And then finally, I'll briefly just highlight 3 groups. There was a group of clergy called the Town Hall Movement, and they supported the family spiritually. And they also led these caravans to Sacramento, the Caravans for Justice, which focused on overturning the police officers' Bill of Rights and also strengthening some of the laws around monitoring, enable us to understand the misconduct police have been involved in. The Oakland Coalition for Justice, they organized on an ongoing basis, demonstrations, and they made some critical connections with organizers in LA, who then formed the Los Angeles Coalition for Justice for Oscar Grant. That was the group that organized massive protests and court support after the trial was moved to Los Angeles County. And then finally, I highlight the Onyx Organizing Committee, and they emphasized Black-led racial justice organizing. They did self-defense, supported community political prisoners, as well as community programs like Feed the People. FTP also stands for something else. Shout out to YG. And that organization later sponsored or started a group that's still around called the Anti-Police Terror Project. So I want to highlight those really quickly and highlight those demands and just really speak to some of that context, because it's really important. First, that historical context then, and thinking about this moment now with rising inequality, the COVID-19 epidemic, the streaming of white nationalism, and this is all happening at this time. And also it's important to understand the geographical context. So BART, when it was built, disrupted Black communities like West Oakland. And so with organizing around BART, a lot of the focus was in Oakland, but it's important to understand structurally, this was a system that was created to transport white suburbanites from the different suburbs back to downtown. BART was created to increase the wealth, the value of properties in downtown San Francisco, Oakland, and then later in the city of Berkeley. And so in organizing at that scale, it's important to just recognize those challenges. And so lastly, just highlighting some of the efforts of organizers have continued to this day.
You froze, so maybe you could rephrase.
Recently, after the ongoing effort to rename Fruitvale Station, pardon me?
You froze the last few seconds. Maybe the last piece you could restate it.
Yeah, no problem. So just highlighting how the efforts have continued. First with Occupy Oakland, they initially named the plaza, renamed it Oscar Grant Plaza. The family has been hosting a vigil for 10 years and people go there on New Year's Day. And they recently put a mural there, Oakland-based artists, and they renamed the street. And so these are part of the things that have kept that movement going. And again, Onyx Organizing Committee created the Anti-Police Terror Project, which is one of the major organizations organizing demonstrations in Oakland and in surrounding areas today. And so as we look back at those protests or even Black Lives Matter, you can look at how the Oscar Grant movement has been a part of our political education. And so I encourage you to be a part of your political education too.
Thank you.
And just for context, there's a photo of me in 2010 in Kemet or Egypt. And you can see I have an Oscar Grant, a Justice for Oscar Grant shirt there. Peace be with you.
Thank you. Thank you. So we have a few questions, and we took from Latin America to the Yellow Peril and Solidarity, and then spoke about really a local case right here in Oakland that really shaped a lot of the responses in the movement. And then the long history of the Black Panther Party, which interesting, used to actually do a lot of Israelis' rights or organizing rights outside Sathergate. One local history is that Black Panther Party used to buy Mao's Red Book from Chinatown and come and sell it to Uc Berkeley students right there at Sathergate and get some of their support. So there's a lot of local connection in here to a lot of the effort for the Black Panther Party. So we have a few questions that are on the Q&A. So there's some questions say, can't say enough about challenging anti-Black racism in our brown communities. So I think this is something that is there. The whole notion that anti-Blackness is not only a white-Black relationship, but if you're living in this modern world, you have absorbed and basically you have your lenses completely shaped by anti-Blackness. So maybe if you want to jump on it, both in terms of Latin America or in China, Juana, please, if you want to jump into that question.
I just want to speak, there's a question here from Pablo, who says, calling ourselves non-Black Latinx seems to deny the rich Black roots of our community. And isn't that also another form of Blackness? There is this wonderful expression, "Y tu abuela dónde está," right? It's like, where's your grandmother? Because so many of us do have, Black people as part of our ancestry. But I come from a very multiracial family, and I see the difference between how I am treated in a store. When people used to hail cabs, that would be the example I would always use. Blackness, visible Blackness, continues to matter. So as much as I am very, very proud of all of the African, the history of my culture, that really is not the same. I do not experience that same level of anti-Blackness. And I think that's really important to recognize. So I think we want to do both. I think we really want to talk about, certainly in Latin America, very rich, long histories of African culture, music, everything, but also histories of anti-Blackness, histories of anti-Black brutality, histories of slavery. And so I think when we just sort of glorify, oh, we're all, we all have these elements, we're kind of not really doing the work of really challenging how the privilege of skin color works in the world. And so for myself, I think that's really just important to sort of say how my experience as a Latinx person is very different than that of Afro-Latinx people. Yeah.
Anyone wants to jump on that question?
I also want to say that the Asian American community, you know, all of us are more mixed, you know, in our families. And my own family, you know, we're incredibly mixed. My father, you know, I have half brothers who are Latinx, indigenous Black background. We have family members, communities of, you know, my husband's family is incredibly mixed. But I think there's that component of our reality. And then there's the component of ideology, you know, that in the US, what we're forced to see are people as in these little boxes, contained differences, you know, that separate us from them. And I think that's what is really kind of the divisive element that we need to kind of go beyond, to see that the common humanity in some ways, not to diminish the inequalities, of course, but that their common thread, there's a fabric that ties us together, but we must work against the ideology of white supremacy that constantly pivots us, you know, against one another, that separates us and really kind of make us, you know, fight against one another. And that we need to work on and struggle against.
If I may just jump in, I think the complexities that we're facing is the following, that anti-Blackness is so wired into the country and is also wired almost globally. But simultaneously, violence against communities of color, again, those who study Latin America, the death squads, the torture, the disorientation over the Monroe Doctrine for so long, then we're speaking about the complete, you know, colonization of Africa from top to bottom, the bombing that takes place over Japan, the US policy in the Middle East over the past so many years. And then how to navigate, speaking of the specific pain of the context of the Black person in America, and creating solidarities of similarity while not actually being lost in the particulars. And that's been very challenging because we're all trying to get the attention of the white supremacists to say that we're human. And that is just so difficult because all of us are engaged in humanizing ourselves to an infrastructure that say you're not a human. And in doing so, we look at each other that you're going ahead of me in being a human than me, and therefore we begin to grab each other back. That's for me is the question of how to create such profound solidarity to understand what we're fighting for and also give the specificity of the pain. I tend to say that we're walking around with post-traumatic stress syndrome collectively as communities of color that have experienced the whole of Eurocentricity ship that we're all living in. And we can never go up to the, what you call, to the top to enjoy the sun. The only way is we climb on each other's shoulders, and that's painful. So that's how I try to really deal and grapple with the complexity of the issue that we are in. So, any question? I know there's a few questions in there. I don't want to put people on the spot, but this is how about dealing with anti-Blackness within the Department of Ethnic Studies at UC Berkeley? So how to deal with that and some of the issues. Institution, again, we are living in an institution that is a result of a particular type of social structure.
I have just one quick comment, and this is a slight shift back to the last question. First, to the PTSD. Yeah, there's also a concept from Dr. Joy DeGruy, particularly for Africans, men in North America, but I think it can be applied wider to those in the diaspora. Post-traumatic slave syndrome, so just living in the wake, as Christina Sharp says, of enslavement. But I actually wanted to speak to something, particularly with Oakland and the Oscar Grant movement, and regarding particularly like the anti-Blackness with Latina communities, and also dealing with or Latinx communities and some of the Black-Asian relationships, two things that I've observed. First, with the Oscar Grant movement, that was set off in many ways by Latino folks or Latinx folks. So whether it's Karina Vargas, who was the one who got the video of Oscar Grant being murdered to KTVU, or some young people in downtown Oakland who thought that some police cars might look a little better upside down. And so I think that with the community he's from, Palm Lucia and Hayward, like that was who he grew up with. And so I think in those moments, like they already had a certain solidarity from being in the communities they grew up in. But I think that example, his daughter, Tatiana Mesa, is Afro-Latino. And so I think just understanding in this practical example, how that can exist, but then how do you do the deep dive and the political education around that? And then I want to actually bring up something that my comrade Kevin Weston, RIP, he brought up in regards to just relating to Chinatown. Like during the Oscar Grant protest, it was this time where there had been all of these media reports about Black on Asian violence, and so there are all these people living in fear of like these young Black folks. And when these protests happened, nobody hit Chinatown. There were some dumpsters that got turned over in the street, but unlike these most recent protests, that didn't get hit. And so he just highlighted that contradiction. And I think, or the lie that some people were telling. And I think that was interesting then to see years later, some of the organizers from that later forming Asians for Black Lives. So I just wanted to speak to some of those like practical connections in Oakland that I think people have been attempting to do that work.
So we're at 4:55. We're 5 minutes behind schedule, and for communities of color, that's great. So really, thank you. Thank you for being with us. I know there's a lot of questions. We'll try as much as possible to put those questions maybe in the chat and later on answer them. And I want to shift maybe to the next session. Thank you for this richful session that we have, transnational and local as well. So I know that Ramon have joined us. So if Ramon is with us, I'm going to turn to Ramon Grasfugel at this point, really to speak about the notion of race, racism, racial markers, and to ground some of the conversation for the next panel. So Ramon, you're up. Make sure to unmute.
Thank you, Hatem. Thank you for taking this initiative. Thank you to the Department of Ethnic Studies. I would like to basically say that when we talk about racism, many times the discussion gets derailed or reduced to a problem of racial prejudice or racial stereotype. And many times we forget the most dramatic dimension of the problem of racism, which is structural institutional racism. And I think that we need to put together the two always, how the racial slanders, racial stereotypes are always entangled with the question about structural institutional racism. Now, having said that, it's important for us to be clear about what is it about institutional racism that makes it unique in a sense. And it has to do, I would say, but it has to do with the methods or the materiality of domination that is exercised by the system towards populations that have been dehumanized under the line of the human. In particular, I refer to methods of violence and dispossession. Usually it's a constant when we are dealing with questions about racism, that you have two sides of the same coin. You have the side of people who get privilege out of that relation of domination, people who benefits from that oppression. And on the other side, you have people who get dramatically, significantly affected as a group. And that has to do with the differential materiality of domination. When it's about the people that are considered the superior beings above the lines of the human, or those who are hyper-humanized by the system. Usually the system, whenever there is a conflict, they use methods of regulation and discourses of emancipation. That is, the system uses methods of legal codes, to handle conflicts, recognition of civil rights, democratic rights, human rights towards the population are classified as superior beings. Then those populations that are below the line of the human are those where the system operates by using methods of violence and dispossession as a constant, okay, in a systematic way. It's not that there's zero violence in the zone of being, but it's always the exception to the rule. In the zone of non-being, in those zones where the people are being dehumanized below the line of the human, you have violence and dispossession as a constant with exceptional moments of peace. So your life is always at stake. Your life is always at risk of any time becoming the target of violence. And this is something that is endemic, inherent to the United States of America. USA was founded on genocide against indigenous people. It was founded on slavery, that is the mass kidnapping of human beings from Africa and their forced transportation to the Americas to be enslaved in the Americas. And so this country from its beginning has been founded on these two aspects or dimensions of violence and dispossession towards indigenous people and Black people. So in the United States of America, I would like to say that what is happening these days is not an exception, it's the rule. You have people of color, indigenous people, Black people, and Latino people, brown people being killed every single day in this country for the past 300 years. That is, it's a constant and a dramatic experience of violence and dispossession towards communities that are considered non-white. And so you have people killed every single day in this country. The difference today from the past is that in the past, there was no recording in videos or audios or things like this of the crimes. So it was the version of the white police vis-a-vis the version of the community. And usually we know that in institutional racism, such as the United States, the racial state in its criminal justice system is racist. So all the police version of the story were always the ones that and now we have a recording of what really happened. We have the gap between the narrative of the police and the reality of the crimes that they committed, but still they come out acquitted from the crimes. They come out clean from the crimes. So it shows you in a dramatic way that the system itself, structurally, institutionally speaking, has a very profound poison, a very profound problem that cannot be solved just by modifying little things. It requires a dramatic transformation of the structures of domination that exist in this country. And I would say, to add to the problem, that is a problem, it's a long-term problem. It's not something that just happened with George Floyd. It has been happening every single day for 300 years. The question is that now we also have the grand wizard of a social movement of white supremacy who is sitting in the White House, okay? Trump is the grand wizard, the imperial wizard of a movement that has been there for a long time, but have been now reorganized in a major way by Donald Trump. Donald Trump is the one calling the shots from the White House. He calls the white supremacists to go and surround the parliament in Michigan. He calls the white supremacists to go and mobilize. He protects them in public. He always talks about them in positive ways. When people protest, then they're calling when the people protesting, he called them thugs. So you could see how the endemic inherent problem of white supremacy in the USA that has been always there, it becomes today more overt or more visible just because we have in the White House the imperial wizard of the KKK running the show from the White House. It becomes very overt now. And you know, the crimes are being committed. And look, and the other problem we're facing is that white supremacy in the USA has two faces. You have the face of the let's go back to the good old times of Trump. That is, let's go back to overt forms of apartheid. That is, let's go back, let's make America great again, which means let's make white America great again. And then you have the liberal multiculturalist version of white supremacy. And that can be captured very clearly in the declaration of Biden last week. Biden said, let's not shoot at them in the heart, let's shoot at them in the legs. So this is very dramatic. I mean, we're talking about, it doesn't matter which side you look in the power structure of US imperialism, you see white supremacy running everywhere with their own little version. So you have the liberal multicultural version, who is keeping, doing the same thing, you know, the same crimes, the same problems of oppression of people of color in the USA, but also abroad. We need to understand that these crimes that are committed inside the United States to people of color are also committed in a global scale by US imperialists in other parts of the world, killing millions of people as we talk. I mean, and these are two sides of the same coin of white supremacy. The liberal multiculturalism, who prefers to have a brown or black face in the administration of the US imperial state to give a multicultural flavor to white supremacy, but keep doing the same thing, okay? Keep doing business as usual. And then you have the other face, which is the face of Donald Trump and this other group who are basically calling to go back to the good old times, quote unquote. So this is a struggle inside the power block of the racial state and white supremacy in the United States. Vis-a-vis that, we have also the organization, a broad social movement, also calling the shots, basically calling to decolonize the US empire, you know, and they are calling, Organized Today, and you could see a lot of faces in the streets that you never saw before, in the streets today, opposing racism and opposing all these crimes against Black people, you know, and, you know, aligning within the slogan of Black Lives Matter, you know, and so you have, I would say that US empire faces in the 21st century a dilemma between continuing business as usual with, you know, white supremacy, or moving forward into decolonizing the empire from within. Decolonizing the empire doesn't mean reforming the empire to keep the empire alive. Decolonizing the empire means transforming the structures of domination that have a long durée in this country, okay, domestically and internationally, because we cannot lose sight that transforming the empire from within is not enough if that same empire is going abroad to kill millions of people, okay, in the name of what? In the name of US interest, oil, you name it. And these killings are also racial. We need to understand white supremacy as an imperial global structure of domination that goes both domestically and internationally. Cannot hear you.
Yeah, thank you, Ramon. I mute myself so it doesn't resonate back into the talk. Thank you for grounding this session, and we'll jump immediately to Sadiq Sheikh from Othering and Belonging, Director of Research He's been doing a lot of work and partnership on a lot of activities. His talk is what neoliberalism has to do with it, the global nature of racial violence. So Sadiq, welcome. Take us to the next presentation. And please, if you have questions, write your questions and we'll have a question and discussion period after two speakers.
Thank you so much, Hatim. Thank you for organizing this gathering of great community and timely conversation in such a short time. You're always standing up for the need of the moment. In this brief kind of intervention, I will try to respond to the call of earlier call of Congresswoman Lee, and also just to follow other speakers to speak to these events and to think of them from historical and global kind of framework, and then just cast that analysis on the state-sponsored violence against Black people in the United States. So firstly, violence against Black people in the United States occurs too often and has been almost normalized. And the demand often focus on police conduct and police reform. But however, this time around, the multiracial and multi-generational masses, while detesting the horrific violence, they ask for system reform beyond just reforming the police. So what we are witnessing during the last 2 weeks in the street of many cities is a revolt against structural racism and racialization. It is a genuine popular revolt that I think that's set mainly to challenge the state-sponsored racial violence against Black lives and other communities of color. But however, uprooting such racial violence required harder labor and earnest imagination and reflection on historical and contemporary realities that enable such violence to exist and to continue till this day for several centuries. So I think what we need to learn from history of capitalist development through the lens of colonialism, slavery, imperialism, and in the present day system crisis, we need also to learn through the prism of neoliberalism. We ought to understand that anti-Blackness violence is related to other racial violence as well, directed toward indigenous people everywhere, and in the surface of a global neoliberal project. Also, we need to be able to see that all the stages of capitalist development in the past 4 or 5 centuries, through slavery, colonialism, imperialism, and the present day neoliberalism, are the ingredients of white supremacy mindset that continue to reproduce racial violence. So you see, racial violence in our today's society stems from a long, long history of capitalist development itself. And it is intertwined with the history of European colonialism, settler colonialism, imperialism, and 20th century globalized neoliberalism. So think of the colonial scramble for Africa's natural resources that led to the slave trade, among other devastations, or the racial violence against Afro-Brazilians, or the racial violence against the Rohingya in Myanmar. So how the current system values, or why the current system values Black life only when it is produces for the advancement of existing system, and disregard these lives when they demanded equity and representation. As we all know that racial violence is the process of social political construction by which a society defines itself by affording to a dominant racial or ethnic or religious group a full set of social, political, legal, cultural, and economic privileges, while simultaneously subjugating, depriving, and dehumanizing other minorities or social groups. Whether is in the 15th century's Africa or today's America, a typical feature of racial capitalism remains the same, that of exploitation and racial violence. This feature is rooted in colonial and imperial narratives that dictate a racial hierarchy of being, in which the subordination of some members of the population is structurally situated within the state and its capacity to inflict pain and suffering on indigenous people and Black and brown people. In 1979, the Kenyan scholar Ali Mazrui, in his examination of what he called it, the African condition, suggested that the condition of Africans' habitability was and is contingent upon three factors: the ecological, the technological, and the socioeconomic condition in which Africans and people of African descent find themselves in it. Therefore, and in order to comprehend the exclusion of subjugated group from the complete rights and privileges afforded to full citizens of the state, it is imperative to understand how and why racial violence has come to exist as an official arm of the state in the first place. So while our analysis should examine and learn from historical patterns and contexts, at the same time, we must also be able to respond to the needs of the current moment, particularly protecting Black lives and exposing gruesome police misconduct, but also to push for creative actions and policies that lay the grounds for transformative change at home and abroad. Some might contend or ask, but what is the relationship between settler colonialism, processes of racialization, to the foundation of global circulation of capital that are themselves racialized and anti-Blackness violence in our times? Yes, there are differences, but also there is profound similarity between settler colonialism, like in the United States society, and the foundation of global circulation of capital that are themselves at the times are racialized. Yet the similarity between settler colonialism and neoliberalism are evident in their pursuit of resources and power grab at all costs and in disregard for human life, that is specifically for Black lives. I will end with this. This time around, the current revolt, the popular revolt in the United States, is different because it takes place during a systemic breakdown of liberal values, the rise of white nationalism, and a global pandemic. Second, it takes place with the participation of a large, multiracial, multi-generational groups during a deadly health crisis that impacted mainly, or to a large extent, people of color. The form of today's revolt in the United States, in particular, have been directed against the integrating forces of neoliberalism and state-sponsored violence. First, as the state of Black American habitability today is shaped by similar dynamics of Africans in the continent due to the colonization of Africa, include economic, legal, and social political system of racial capitalism. There is a profound desire advanced by Black social movement in the light of Black death to overhaul the entire system of structural racism and institutional racism. Second, as Cedric Robinson reminded us that, quote, representation in society shapes, and it's shaped by political, cultural, economic, aesthetic, and social life, end quote. Therefore, multiracial, multi-generational rebellion, which is in itself is a work in progress, remain vital for the future beyond racial violence against Black. But it needs to be grounded in a critique of racial capitalism and in imagining a future where everyone belongs. So in terms of the work ahead, we need to continue to push for creative actions and policies that lay the ground for transformative change. To do that, I think we need to ground our analysis and movements in the critique of racial capitalism, but also to imagine a new future for a fair, inclusive, and sustainable society and sustainable world. The nationwide call to roll back staggering police and military budget and for reinvestment of those funds in healthcare, education, housing, climate resilience, and other social structures, especially in communities of color that have been impoverished and terrorized by discriminatory state intervention, represent a first step toward shaping a future that is void of racial violence and neoliberalism. Another subject that, or another piece that a lot of you spoke about it is in terms of global solidarity. As international leaders that have been speaking out in solidarity with Black people, and protesters in the United States, also they should also take this opportunity to address the structural forms of racial and ethnic injustices in their own nations and within the international system itself that continue to devalue non-European lives. So yes, we admire the people-to-people's global solidarity, but we need to intensify that type of global solidarity against all systemic racism and injustices everywhere, not selectively. And lastly, I would call on all of us to imagine what we can do or what we should be doing now, regardless of resource constraint, to create narratives that gives meaning to issues of social change, to all that, so that all people can see the necessity to act on transformative change. Thanks.
Thank you, Sadiq. We'll come back to some of the questions in a few minutes. And let me go immediately to Kiko Yamanaka from Asian American Studies Department. Her talk is Race, Racism, Racialization in East Asian Migration. So Kiko, take us.
Okay. Thank you very much, Hayden. This is an opportunity for me to talk about racism that is embedded in East Asian migration that occurred since the late 1980s. So my talk is not complete, exact issue about American racism, but let me just, so I'm responding to the process of race construction in East Asia through labor migration. Mm-hmm. So I have prepared the brief PowerPoint, so I'll just go to it. Host disabled screen sharing. So can I go screen sharing? Mm-hmm. It says host disabled, attendee screen sharing.
Yeah. Okay, now you see if you could.
Okay, let me see. All right. So which one to go? I'm sorry. Why don't I will skip it. Yeah. Oh, this is the one. No, this could be the one.
Yeah, if you click on share screen, it should be giving you.
Yeah, I did. Okay, so this is it.
That's it.
Yeah. This is a very simplified version of what I do in the global studies about the division of labor between handful rich countries and also the less developed countries. So I will go to the next one, abstract. So let me just quickly read this. In the US, race is constructed based on visible differences of the people, most notably in skin color, that mark history of exclusion and exploitation. In contemporary East Asia, labor migration has given rise to the new racism based on differences in economic development, nationality, gender, and culture. Circular migration, which may be termed a guest worker system, a common policy of unskilled immigration system in Asia, permits migrants to enter, work, and return home after a few years. This allows the host country to maximize economic benefits of disposable labor without concerns for social welfare, settlement, and citizenship. Racism against migrant workers is thus institutionalized in policy, and the racialization of migrant workers occurs in the media and everyday life at destination countries. So I just go quickly what I wanted to tell about East Asia, but I will go back to the construction of race in the US. That is primarily Black and versus white descendants of slaves versus settlers from Europe. And when 1965 New Immigration Act opened the door to Latin America and Asia, massive migrants came and the dynamics have changed. So let me just focus on Asian American immigration history very briefly. Professor Lok Siu explained this very eloquently, so I will go very quickly. So Asians in the earlier period, starting with the Chinese, yet are seen to be yellow peril, somebody and a group of people bringing some evils from the different shores. And then some groups, notably Japanese Americans, started to raise families and settled in the U.S. longer. And then these people are seen to be aliens and assimilable others, uncivilized people. And then after 1965, Asians become modern minority, those who do not complain, who just work industrialists without much of sort of claiming the public fund. But yet, in culturally, Asians are always constructed as eternal foreigners based on their yellow, quote unquote, face, who do not belong. So no matter how long Asians are in America, they are not Americans. Third generation, the fourth generation Asian, Japanese Americans or Chinese Americans would be asked, where did you get that good English? So construction of others, it's always power relationships. So moving to the circular labor migration in East Asia, this is a very prototype of a guest worker system. Labor migration divides Asia into the two camps. That one is one side and the very rich, wealthy, but yet shrinking in terms of populations, and then seriously suffering from the acute labor shortage. So these countries, Hong Kong, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, Singapore, Taiwan, are the ones that import, so-called import migrants in expensive ways from other countries, surrounding Asian countries, Southeast Asia, Philippines, Indonesia, other common labor sending countries. Now they are joined by the new young nations in terms of labor sending, fresh young people eager to work from Vietnam, Cambodia, Myanmar. From South Asia, Bangladesh, Pakistanis are always present, even in East Asia. Now Nepal has joined. So in a way, this dichotomous is very clear in terms of economic development. And yet the point is that one, the Asian countries that now receive laborers from the surrounding countries are the ones, former labor sending countries to the US. Sometime where from 1950s to 1980s, migration transition occurred to these countries. Now these countries are big, powerful economic forces that attracts young workers, very industrious, very eager to work. So immigration policy of these countries in Asia are very clear. That is, the unskilled workers from less developed countries are not allowed to bring with families, no settlement, therefore no access to citizenship. And guest worker system is a very good system, economically rationalized extraction of labor. And the workers are always going into the highly segregated labor market with no mobility. That is, migrant workers at unskilled levels are assigned to the employers with the unattractive jobs that no citizen workers would like to take. And yet these workers from Southeast Asia, South Asia are not allowed to change their jobs, even though the employers can be extremely abusive. So this is a very important key point to place the migrant workers and then not allow them to move around. And then, of course, no social welfare benefit is allowed. So I call this institutionalized or legal racism embedded immigration policy. And then construction of race, I should go back a little bit one more time. That is, the visible race or physical differences are not present in this case in a very contrasted way as shown in the case of US black and white. It's more a graduation of change in the skin colors from East Asia to Southeast Asia and South Asia. And then so is culture, history, all connected that from East Asia, Southeast Asia, and then South Asia, it's not something as visible. I think it's an important point to understand that it's another example of race to be a construction. So I consider that is the race is in the migration experience of East Asian case is constructed based on nationality, class, that means economic development, and cultural differences, and gender. Gender plays an important role because women are assigned to very intensive labor, reproductive labor. Labor shortages in this aging society is huge, growing. No one wants to take by the citizen in the citizens. So racism in immigration policy is embedded to exclude unskilled migrants from less developed countries. This fits very well in terms of economic rationality and the growing neoliberal global economy in the Asian region, global cheap labor without social welfare. And also there's a certain ideology embedded in some history in East Asia, ideology of social homogeneity. That is the nation state consisting of the same people with the same culture and the same history. No one else should be on the nation's territory. So, but yet the labor shortages are so acute that people from other countries started to work. And yet, so to segregate the people from other countries, neighboring Asian countries, less developed. So policy has worked to marginalize foreigners as others who do not belong. Race or color is not the big factor, but the media often treats foreigners from the less developed countries, criminals who come to Japan, come to South Korea, and then just creates the disorder and fear to the people. And then so images of foreigners, those who started to coming to the towns throughout the country in the East Asian countries, they are seen to be kind of scary, little darker skinned people, especially young males coming together, and these are the unclean, uncivilized outsiders. That's the images that all these policies and the medias and the discourses bring into the minds of the people in everyday life. So quickly, discussions and questions. So it's clear to me that is another factor, another way to create race in a society, in a global neoliberal economy. So racism, racialization in East Asian migration settings is to organize, institutionalize the undesirable people not to settle down, but yet to extract young, willing labor for a short period of time, putting them into the segregated residence and market. So yet, in this grand scheme of dividing the region into two, changes are certainly happening. One, these East Asian countries with the rapidly aging population and therefore serious labor shortages concentrated in the certain industries are growing to depend on the migrant workers, especially in construction and the elderly care. These are the very important areas, but yet locals do not want to engage in. So at the same time, because migrants are often treated with all kinds of the inhuman ways, not the really social benefits available, therefore concerned citizens have come to organize themselves in order to help migrant workers, still they may not be able to change the systems, but yet there are a lot of small group or sometimes nationally coalition groups come to raise awareness for rights of migrant workers to the nation who are not really accustomed to the concept of the rights of foreigners. And at the same time, in this transnational culture and also the space and in time contracted, the migrants have also become more aware of their own power, although they are very much under pressure for my work abroad with lots of debts. They owed money to the brokers, but yet some of them come to organize labor unions, push vocal about human rights, and they are well connected to their families back home, and also the people of the same language speaking or cultural background across the boundaries. At the same time, I think this is something in the long run, Southeast Asian countries and South Asian countries in the past 10 years or so have really experienced rapid economic development. And I do not know, it takes a long time for them to give full employment to their nations, but this kind of prolongs economic development of South and Southeast Asian countries would change the dynamics of the migration for the people who had to leave for incomes, but now they may find the jobs in their own countries. How would it affect to the countries, Asian countries that are now heavily relied on migrant workers, not yet seen. So this is where I am, and I hope this would give you some examples of racism and racialization through East Asian migration. Thank you.
Thank you. We have some few minutes for questions, so both for the panelists as well as others that are part of the panelists. Please ask your question if you have a question to any of our three speakers, and let's have a conversation. Perfecta, I see that you had, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. Kiko,
yes,
you talked about in the racialization of migrant workers now in East Asia, that they are kind of depicted as being dark. Like, how is that connected to anti-Blackness? Is that does that predate anti-Blackness? Is there this?
The contact with Black people is much more recent, whereas Southeast Asia, it's a melting pot, and the Chinese have migrated for centuries to the Southeast Asia, and the culture and the people are very, very much hybrid. And whereas African Americans arrived in a visible significant number after the World War II, right? The military bases throughout Asia brought the Americans, both white and Black people. And then the discrimination against Black is I think it's import, not native to East Asia.
So where does that like depicting while racializing, depicting as dark, where does that come from?
I think it's white skin, East Asia too, consider especially for women, that means urbane, high class, sophisticated, and that nobility, that kind of the skin, white collar skin worship still remains very strong.
Any other questions? Maybe Ramon, you touched on the global nature of race and how it functions, and especially in relations to violence. So violence toward darker bodies does not engender the same type of response if it's violence against the white superior. So how do we navigate that, the violence again, since the US war on terror, almost 7 to 8 million from 1979 to now, yet we don't think of these numbers.
Yeah, I think that the problem with racism is that it's a global problem of a civilization that I call the capitalist, patriarchal, Western-centric, Christian-centric, modern colonial world system. I use a long phrase at the risk of sounding ridiculous, because I think we need to put in the political economy of the system itself everything that is at stake. That is, there is a multiplicity of power relations, a broad package of power relations that is put forward by the European colonial expansion. The European colonial expansion 500 years ago was not only an expansion of an economic system, was an expansion of a civilization. That is, it destroyed all the civilization it encountered and then imposed a Western-centric, Christian-centric civilization at a world scale. Now, race and racism became an organizing principle of the political economy. That is, race and racism organizes who does what, how much you earn for what you do, and so on. And the way they did it was through violence. That is, there's no, they didn't arrive to a place and put a democratic ballot for people to decide that we're going to be enslaved or colonized. They just came with their weapons and imposed themselves everywhere. And this is what the world we have today is a result of 500 years of racial capitalism. You want to call it in the short term. I prefer to use this long phrase just to call attention to the entanglement of the multiple oppression that is inherent to the political economy, the system we live. So what happened is that then there is a whole part of humanity that in this civilization are considered non-human or subhuman. And then there is a small portion of humanity that are considered superior beings. So this structure, this logic, racial logic of domination, organizes the international division of labor, capital accumulation, modernity, the way modernity works. And this is how the system basically organizes its international imperial relations. So that's why when they colonize, when they go abroad to impose their will and their interests in another country, they don't care how many people they kill. They can wipe out millions of people, but after all, these people are considered non-human, subhuman, and they don't even count them. I mean, look, the wars of the USA in abroad, they never count the bodies of people they kill. They always count their soldiers of the US Army who has been killed. But the people who are killed by the US Army are never counted. That tells you something about the dehumanization, mass dehumanization of human beings, you know, that you have in US empire and its behavior at a world scale. So this happened, this is what I want to tie it, that is not only a domestic problem, because we know that USA was formed through a stellar colonial project, and it was formed internally through colonialism, but also abroad, internationally, you have the other face of white supremacy, which is doing the same atrocities to people of color abroad. This is why we're talking about, you know, an imperial system that is white supremacy. Imperialism has these terrible consequences to the population of the world at large. And look at the complicities of US empire in the colonization of Palestine today. Look at how US empire is backing up this stellar colonial project there of also mass killing and genocide of Palestinian people. And look at how the Israeli state, as a genocidal state, racial state, is also embedded in the structure of domination USA. And you could see that, for example, in the training of the police all over the place in the USA. That technique of putting the knee in the throat of someone, that's an Israeli technique. It's obvious that the Minneapolis police was trained by the Israelis. So you can see the entanglement at a world scale of a machine of imperial white supremacy operating. And what we're facing now, Hatem, is that this civilization of death is putting at stake life in planet Earth, human life and non-human life. And so we are now at a turning point, you know, and especially with this pandemic, where either we get rid of this system or the system will get rid of the human species in planet Earth. This is what we're facing. And I'm putting it dramatically, but this is where we're at. We don't know how long we're going to go on as human species in planet Earth, you know, with this system of destruction, death, etc. You know, it's killing human life. It's privileging profits of capital over human life. And we see that in the pandemic. Look at how USA has the capacity to destroy 10 times planet Earth, you know, military capacity of doing that, but they don't have the capacity to handle the health of the population because they don't have enough beds, they don't have enough oxygen machines, they don't have enough hospitals, etc., etc. So it tells you something about how we got now with this pandemic, everything has become overt, and the killing of George Floyd became like the, you know, like a turning point for many people. Like, you know, on top of everything we're going through, all the dispossession, now we have to handle these everyday killings. You know, we cannot continue with this. We have to stop this somewhere or another. And just putting a little reform here and there is not going to make it. That's why there are a youth in the streets today that are fed up by all these killings.
There's one question that I will take, this last question that comes from our Facebook audience. And the question says, I find academics and the political social left in general making a strong effort to educate the public regarding racism, anti-Blackness, microaggression, institutional racism. But then once they go out or once they go to the corporate structure and working space in general, they begin to conforming to cultural whiteness, they see it beneficial and so on. So what we do in education is basically gets to be pushed to the side. So in essence, the relationship between what we educate people and what people do after they leave the college. So in essence, neoliberalism and how, in essence, you could say that our effort to educate is still facing a major wall. So anyone, you could jump maybe briefly before we move to the next. Yeah.
In the Asian American studies, I teach courses on gender and generation, and I talk about history of Asian American and deal with a number of cases about the racism that Asians are subjected. The young generation of Asian Americans are very keen to learn about dynamics of constructing them as model minority. But at the same time, they become, through the history, learning about their own history, going back 150 years even today, and then the continuous experience of racism made them aware of other groups, of course, African Americans especially, and then Latinos, and then my students who wanted to become doctors and lawyers and accountant, and then they go on to career to pursue their professional life. But once in a while, I receive from them a letter a few years later, and then one student said, I am now in the medical school taking internship in East Coast, and your course taught me about how to open up our eyes to the people who are in a very different institutionalized racism or poverty and many other things. That course made me really rich. I think it's still we are doing education. We may not ourselves engage in activism, but through the theories, case studies, and the discussions, students who didn't really look at other groups do become aware of deep-rooted issues which are relevant to them.
Sadaf, do you want to jump in for a minute on this? Or?
Sure. I think one of the misconceptions about how we see ourselves as a public intellectual or provider for educations, that we often, that's in relation to the question, we separate ourselves from the social conditioning that we are in. So I don't think most of our curriculum might be in the right place, but not necessarily providing all the time the critical examination of the system in itself. So we're dealing a lot of time with symptoms. And even when we do the critical thinking, our social conditioning not allowing the students themselves to be able actually to have the tools to fight that system that they want to disengage with. As I mentioned earlier in my brief introduction, that racialized capital, it comes from our participations. It doesn't come from anywhere else. There is no only imposition somewhere. So I cannot go and participate, for example, in the US Armed Forces and bombing Yemen. And I think of myself as, I get trained in whatever, understanding system of oppression or otherwise. So our actions themselves and our choices vis-a-vis our social conditioning is a result of supporting the system in place. So I do agree with you. Our higher education is extremely neoliberalist. So I'm not quite sure what we give. Yes, we engage, some of us, but that's not necessarily all of us. And some of us facing huge challenges in how to teach, even within this higher education, if we afford this opportunity. So how many people look like us teaching higher education? Maybe United States could be the best example, but if you turn your direction to Europe, it is appalled. Like, you can't find people who look like the majority of people of color who live in Europe teaching them. So those kind of different things. And another thing that Ramon mentioned, I'm coming from the global South. Our global South educational system is extremely colonized, extremely alienated from our own social conditioning. So even when we train our public intellectuals or professionals, we train them in a way in which the colonizer want to train us, even though they left long time ago, but coloniality remains intact on those places.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Last minute, Ramon.
Yes, I completely agree with Dr. Sadiq, because I think that one of the problems we face to fight back is our internal colonial racisms, and that all these narratives, Eurocentric narratives, have been internalized in our minds and bodies of people who are themselves oppressed by structures of domination, racial domination. And that is one of the main obstacles we have for the unity of fighting back white supremacy. When we are fighting among ourselves, reproducing the same, racisms from white supremacy, but now internalized in the bodies and minds of the people who are the victims of that system, now we cannot fight together, because now we have Latino community having racial prejudice against Black people, Black people having also their, prejudice against indigenous people or whatever, so suddenly we are in the law of the jungle. So part of fighting back efficiently implies an internal or a decolonization of the mind. We need to decolonize our minds to move forward too, but this is not that we're going to go into some kind of new age treatment in a mountain. This has to go at the same time we fight outer structures of domination. We need to fight our inner structures too. And this has to happen at the same time. You cannot disentangle this or wait till you are pure and perfect to fight back. So I'm saying this because part of the divisions we face in terms of fighting white supremacy in the USA and the world at large is our own internal colonizations that impede us from moving forward.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a great panel, great discussion. We covered a variety of topics. Now I'm going to throw it to Basima Sizmore from Othering and Belonging. She's going to take us through the last few speakers, and then we'll conclude. I know it's been 3 hours, but we have a lot of material. I just sent out a request, said, who wants to present? And everybody that responded got this conversation going. I see it as a first step for us to continue. So Basima, please take us through the next panel.
Hello all, thank you Dr. Bazian. Welcome to all of our presenters and to everyone online. Thank you for being with us today. As Dr. Bazian mentioned, I'm going to be facilitating the last session and leading us into the closing remarks. So to start for this session, we have Babalwa Kwanali, and her talk is on From the Front Lines, Understanding the Impact of Trauma, Violence, and Racism on Communities of Color. So welcome, and please begin when you're ready.
Okay, thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum. And thank you, Brother Hatem, for putting this together. And I've had a chance to listen in. So I am a therapist that has been working for the past 20 years and in our marginalized communities, providing mental health treatment and trauma, focusing on trauma. I also do trainings for members of the community that are therapists. So one of the things that I do want to start off with the talk a bit is, like I said, from the front lines. I also live in the community and lived in East Oakland for a number of years. And I've heard many folks talk about the enslavement experience in America. And I, agree with what other panelists said. One thing that I do want to point out is that the enslavement experience in the United States was something called chattel slavery. And Brother Rashid mentioned Dr. Joy DeGruy, and there's a lot of information that comes from her related to post-traumatic slave syndrome. And the enslavement experience in America, like I said, is one that is rooted in chattel slavery. When we mention chattel slavery, it is treating people with that and seeing them as subhuman, treating them as animals, even so much of wearing the collars around their necks, and the type of abuse to this day, it isn't even done to animals back then in the Southern times. And so that has had dramatic effects on the family, on the community, and in the African-American community for centuries, for what we call multi-generational trauma, which means it's a trauma experience that continues from generation to generation to generation. And now there's this research that's going into something called epigenetics, which is looking at the epigenetics of trauma, meaning that it can genetically pass down from family to family, community to community. So let me just give you a brief snippet when I think of communal trauma, and I'll be mindful of my time. And also looking at the post-traumatic slave syndrome and what's happening with chattel slavery, what had happened with chattel slavery. So we're looking at kidnaps, beatings, rapes, and horrible abuses that the mind can't even fathom happening to another human being in front of white persons who were slave owners. And those were the ones that also perpetrated it. So the picture that I'm trying to paint is when we think about white supremacy and we think about chattel enslavement, something happened in that process. Something very inhumane happened in that process. A person who could do such things to a human being, like kneeling on a person's neck for 8 minutes and 48 seconds, I believe it was, that takes something, there's a part of self that disappears within humanity that's gone. And I would encourage participants and folks in the audience to really to look into some of the atrocities that happened with enslavement and chattel slavery in particular, the type of abuses. I do also want to take a look at like the medical system, and what I'm building for you is a picture of why mistrust exists to this day in the African-American communities and in communities of color. So we take a look like in the mental health system, for instance. One of the founding fathers, Dr. Benjamin Rush, had some really racist thinking. Drapetomania was one of them, in terms of like a slave's desire to want to run away is a mental health disorder. And so this came from the founding father of psychiatry, American psychiatry. So we fast forward to what's happening in our communities now and what our community witnessed with the killing of George Floyd. And one of the other panelists earlier today talked about the use of video cameras and materials like that to sort of show the community what has been happening. And I'd like to say that in the South, those were also public displays of hangings, of lynchings, of tar and feathering an individual, of decapitating an African American person, removing their genitals in public. These were all public displays of something called a picnic, right? Which is why I don't use the word, I hate the word picnic. And they would pick an individual and have them there on the public display to witness torture. Witness babies being thrown into the air and shot like you're doing target practice. These are some routine practices that happened during chattel slavery. And so what the world witnessed most recently with George Floyd was something that is seen within communities of color all the time. It either A, doesn't make it to the news, or it's something that isn't publicized. And so that begins to have a profound impact on the mental health of the community at large. So my piece was looking at on the front lines and seeing the things, that the atrocities that people, the world had a chance to see with Brother Floyd's death was, like I mentioned, something that people see within the community, and it begins to create this communal sense of trauma. Now, one of the things in our mental health field is that we take a look at something called post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder is obviously trauma that begins to happen after, or feelings of trauma that happens after an episode. Sometimes a single episode, sometimes multiple episodes, like witnessing a horrific car accident or a shooting or violence. And that tends to focus on just on the individual. Now, when we're looking at the communal aspect of trauma, we're looking at a simultaneous group of people that have witnessed the same trauma simultaneously and have experienced it simultaneously and begin to have simultaneous reactions to such a horrific trauma. This is something that has been happening in the community for such a long time. And one of the things that's adding to the community response to the killing of George Floyd, because so many of us within the African American community and Black and Brown communities have been saying, this has been happening, this is not new. This has been happening for a really long time, and it is impacting the mental health of our community. So I'd like to give a definition of complex trauma. And so complex trauma is something that it begins to impact the person, the individual, and the community on multi-levels, meaning that it impacts our health, physical health. So when we take a look at some of the numbers related to diabetes, heart disease, cancers, breast cancer, obesity, all of these things are reactions to trauma and reactions to racial stress. And then we take a look also in terms of schools, education. It's difficult for a child to learn if they just saw somebody shot and killed just yesterday. You know, I've had those experiences in working with young folks who have witnessed violence. However, and then to come to school and not have teachers or staff have no understanding of what that trauma does to an individual. That person can't necessarily turn in a homework assignment, let alone be able to focus on school alone. It's difficult for any person to learn once they've experienced trauma. And now the world is seeing what that feels like. I've heard so many professionals saying that they're having a difficult time focusing, having a difficult time sleeping, eating, all these things that are happening. And for some people, those are new experiences. And what I argue is that within communities of color that are impacted with racism on a daily basis, I call it like death by 1,000 cuts, these are some things that become almost like the norm, which is not normal, it's not okay, but it is something that is a lived reality. It also impacts our jobs, our ability to work, our faith. It impacts us completely all the way around. And these are some things that, and to make it even worse, the harder part is having an absence of an opportunity to heal. And that's something that Dr. Joy talks about. And even worse yet, having an experience of denying what has happened to an individual, saying that, well, what you're going through in your community is really not so bad. In fact, it's really your fault. And so there's many of these messages that come back that compound the sense of the trauma experience of racism, which makes it much more complex. And it's something that does not stop. We know that our bodies are designed to keep us alive. It sends us, adrenaline, cortisol, all these other hormones flood our bodies when we are attacked with the trauma situation that's happening, so that we can be able to fight, flight, freeze, and survive. Now imagine that happening every day, all the time, and those never turn off. And so that's what we're looking at with complex trauma, and the resiliency of the people who have dealt with such prolonged, protracted trauma over generations, multi-generations, is incredible. And to be able to still have faith and hope and build and things like that is incredible. So one of the things that we're looking at, I'll do a brief shameless plug here, related to a project that we're working on within the city of Berkeley, is the African American Holistic Resource Center. And that takes a look at all the things that I mentioned and begin to provide resources for members of the community. So I've posted and gave it to Brother Hatem, the link to the feasibility study. There's also lots of research that's there around trauma and complex trauma. So I will stop there, and there's a lot more that I can say about that, but I don't want to go over on time, and I'm open for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Babalwa. We really appreciate your participation in this panel and sharing the resources and just being here. I would like to introduce our next speaker, which is Professor Harvey C. Dong. He is a professor or lecturer in the Department of Ethnic Studies at UC Berkeley, and his talk today, the title is Black Lives Matter Movement and Anti-Asian Racism, Building Solidarities. So welcome, and please begin when you're ready. If you're speaking, you're on mute. Are you there, Professor Dong?
He was there a minute
Okay.
ago, I saw him.
He says, yes, you might be on mute then, and I'm not seeing.
Maybe that's me. Maybe he logged out. Okay, he logged out, and then I'll put him back in the panel. So just 1 second. So Harvey, are you with us now?
Looks like it.
Yes. Okay, good.
Okay, great. It's been a long day, and I heard a lot of wonderful talks today, and especially with regards to the question about intergenerational trauma, which I feel affects. In fact, I could see the dire effects on the African American community, and also the effects on peoples of color in general, in varying degrees. So that's a pretty important point for us to look into more. I myself was involved in the long struggle to establish ethnic studies from the beginning, and we didn't really complete what we had set out to do. And I know that every 10 years or so, students want the campus to relate to their needs and the needs of their community, which would include anti-racism and anti-police violence work. And I would say that institutionally, the university has been very successful in blocking the full blooming and blossoming of ethnic studies. And we need to see how this moment can be a change within that. You know, how can we make ethnic studies relevant, meet the needs of our students, and our research and all our efforts are dedicated to critiquing, tearing down, and rebuilding the system. you know. So I still feel pretty strongly about that, although it can get very wearing on you over the years, because it's been like 50 years of the history of ethnic studies. A lot of the students I noticed that come to the classes, they feel that they reach a certain level of understanding, but they need more. They need something where they have application and practice, and then they take what they learned, applied in the community, or they learn new stuff in the community, and then they want to bring it back to the classroom, you know, back and forth, that type of knowledge, understanding. But that's not really happening, although I hope that today's event will change that, you know, because we need to change it. And this is an opportunity to change that. Okay. George Floyd was murdered. People fed up. There's a movement going on, tremendous movement. I think just over the weekend in the Bay Area, there was something like 40 demonstrations. There's lots of openings and opportunities for advancement now, and we can't let it go back to the way it was. So I would say for this conference, kudos to Hatem and the committee. You know, this is perfect timing for this. It's a very good start, and I hope that next week, you know, we don't. I hope that next week is not quiet. My own experience in police violence related work is very limited. I remember in the mid 1970s, I got clubbed by a police officer after a city council meeting when I went to a protest against the murder of this young Black teenager, Tyrone Guyton. That's mid 1970s, and I would say that kind of traumatized me as far as how I view the police, where I could trust them, you know, because especially you get hit in the head, it does leave not just a physical mark, but a mental mark. And there were other instances where police were called in on the Asian community, especially with regards to the I Hotel and also daily police practices that we don't really care much about because Asians are supposed to be the model minority, but it happens, okay? There was 5 points before we leave that I've been trying to think through, 5 areas that we can learn from the struggle today. One is that Asian Americans need to see themselves historically and presently as peoples of color. We need to stand opposed to anti-Blackness in our own communities. A good example of that is what's happening in Minnesota, where Hmong community members, community orgs, and some lower level politicians support the arrest of Hmong police officer To Tao, who was complicit in George Floyd's murder. Okay, so this idea of Asian Americans standing with the struggle. There's a need also for cross-racial solidarity. There's a tendency within our own ethnic communities to be only concerned about our own issues. That has to change. The fight should not just be about our own. We are connected. The pain in the Black community is pain in the Asian community. A third point, being anti-racist means to be an internationalist. I liked hearing that, the examples that different speakers spoke out. This has become a global movement. If it's a global movement, it's very inspirational. Fourth point, being woke is not enough. Declarations can become short-lived. Actions are more important than words. What are we going to do about it? UC has a lot of buildings named after white supremacists, and there's institutions. UC is an institution that practices white supremacy, and that has to be evaluated. Fifth point, for as an instructor, listening is more important now than ever. As educators, we need to find out more where student thinking is at. And also we need to find out and investigate what community voices are saying about their situation. we can't just speak for the community. We have to learn from the community. And our challenge is to change ourselves internally so that we can become a relevant and vibrant department and eventually a college in the future. Okay, so that's all I have to say. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Dong. And our final speaker for today is Professor Hatem Bazian, who is also in the Department of Ethnic Studies at UC Berkeley. And I open it up to you for your closing remarks, Dr. Bazian.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm going to actually share a screen that I have just to conclude in terms of how I see things and how I work on things. And this is a slide. Just give me a second. In order for us to really, when we think about the what we're experiencing and what we see on a daily basis in the United States, we have to connect it to the long history of colonial discourse and what colonial discourse is about. And I focus on 6 features of modern colonization. One, it's global. 85% of the world's surface has experienced one form of colonization or another. So the European colonial project was global in nature. It covered every continent and touched the known and brought the unknown parts of the world into the newly developed colonial system. So we often think of colonialism as in the past and it touches one part or the other. It is a global phenomenon. And you could see that what the Portuguese, the Spanish, the British, the Dutch, the French, the Germans, the Italians, their footprint touched every part of the world. So our experience of the world that we are in is shaped by this colonial experience. So somebody asked me what type of a person you are. I say, well, I know that I was born in Palestine, in the Southern Hemisphere, but my main frame is really been absorbed to Eurocentricity. So the world I see, the history I read, the culture that we experience, even the formative relations that we form are all constructed around Eurocentricity. The second is that it's a racial project. The colonial era was distinctively racial and emerged at the intersection of the line of demarcation between the human and subhuman, which is the work of Ramon Grasfugel and others. We have to understand that we are living in a racial project, and both the image in the beginning and this image is just paradigmatic of this racial project. The rest of the world is still carrying on its back Europe and North America, as well as carrying the racial superior in the global South. So you have a racial superior in the global South, just like you have the global North that is posited as the superior. So we're in a total racial project, and the racial hierarchy, racial matrix is still there. Europe and whiteness. Europe crafted itself as being white and Christian, and that has to be understood in the formation of the world. The superior, that which is touched, is to be really the white and Christian simultaneously. So if you don't belong to those two categories together, not separate, but together, then you actually are not part of the higher superior race construction. Colonialism and race, we must, again, this is a French prime minister, we must say openly that indeed the higher races have a right over the lower races. I repeat that the superior races have a right because they have a duty. They have the duty to civilize the inferior races. So again, this notion of civilization, this notion of white man burden, it's really not been undone. It's still there, and you could see it in a variety of different ways, and it's expressed on a regular basis. So we need to understand this. So Derek Chauvin knee on George Floyd, he is seeing himself as being superior, as being a person that is endowed not only with the right to govern, but also the right to take life, because that life in there, from his sense, is inferior in its epistemic location within this world. Thinking about colonialism as being economics, capitalism, and technology. So the colonial era marshaled the fusing between the newly developed modes of economic production, capitalism, technological innovation, exploration that is dissimilar to any pre-modern period. And in essence, it marshaled all of its resources to make this world that we are currently experiencing and are, in essence, the object of this enormous enterprise. So colonialism and economics, it was political and economic system. We always need to do that. Raw material and looking for finding outlets for the finished product. And I don't want to go into more longer discussion, but you cannot speak of colonialism without infusing the political and economic system simultaneously to understand that link, which has not changed. We still depend on raw material from the global south to be shipped to the north for finished products and then brought back, while understanding the changes that are taking place relative to China. But the information technology has really have reoriented the basic contour, but it's still founded upon this dynamic. Speaking of genocides, not only one, but multiple genocides. The onset of global settler colonialism made genocide of indigenous population as a matter of policy. And we have to speak about the multiplicity of genocides that have occurred, and we still have not, actually, as the earlier discussion about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that Congresswoman Barbara Lee spoke about, we have not yet even scratched the surface to actually speak about the genocides that have been committed in the New World. In terms of the world, the United States has 331 million people with only 6.7 million native population, indigenous population, 2.09%. So 97% from Trump to everyone else, we arrived in here. And unless we begin to commit ourselves to understanding the legacy of genocides to the native population, we have to really undo that history by our affirmative steps to both narrate the history, but also shift the contours of what we consider to be belonging, considering that the presidents always say wants to take the country back and make America great again. Again, we'll ask the Native American and the indigenous population, what do they think of that theme? And then the multiple genocides in the global south. And I'm sorry for some of these images. These are some from Australia, where it's taking the heads of individuals in studying anthropology. The French in Algeria, severing the heads and using them as trophy. The genocides in the Congo. Africa has been decimated north, south, east, west, and continue to be the area where intervention and continued dehumanization is there. So again, the question of violence and looting. If you really want to see sophisticated looting, just go and visit any of European museums or any of the museums that in the United States, then you could see the sophisticated structure of looting that was structured and lasted a long period of time. Again, the multiple genocides that took place across the period, and how to actually recording all genocide. Do people of darker races, Africans, African Americans, those who inhabit the Southern Hemisphere, do we mourn their lives? Do we record their lives? And where are all those records? Again, it's those who we deem to be really destined to death. Then slavery, and again, demand-driven, its genocidal campaign against the indigenous population opened the door for the mass commodified exportation of enslaved people. The numbers between 12.5 to possibly 35 million. And just think about the trauma, both back into Africa, West Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, those who died in the Middle Passage, and those who've been traumatized and continue to be traumatized transgenerationally. Often when we speak about the transatlantic slave trade. It has to be European slave trade, and has to be insisted that the countries in the societies that engaged in this massive trade, as if the transatlantic, as if the Atlantic Ocean itself was the mechanism or what is engaged in. So in here, even narrating has an element in terms of language that needs to be included. And then Christianity, religion, and colonization. The colonial era brought Christianity as imperial colonial imposed religion. And that continues, if you think about white supremacy, it justifies itself through theology, through religious discourse. And what we need is to understand how this religious discourse tend to shape the consciousness around this discussion. So this, for me, just an initial foray on the discussion to understand what are the scope of the challenge that is in front of us is none other than decolonizing our mind, decolonizing our institution, and really decolonizing economy structures and so on. So the policing is one aspect of it. And what I want to possibly put in the conversation is, as we come back in the fall on campus, what are the projects and things that we need to think about to change? I've been at least thinking about that the UC Berkeley, or at least the university, has so many different extended education program or campuses outside of the campus, but all are in the corporate arena, are in San Ramon, in San Francisco, financial district, in Silicon Valley. But where is our institutions that supposedly are in East Oakland, in Richmond, in Pittsburgh, in places where we actually are thinking? We always complain we don't have enough Black students on campus. That for me is putting the problem on the Black students as if they need to find our address. So for me is unconscionable to think that we have one of the largest cities in the country in terms of African American, both history, culture, tradition, political engagement, economics, and so on. And then we actually get the excuse to say that we can't find African Americans. I think for us, we need to create our urban colleges and ways for us to be living with the communities that we're educated. And so hopefully when we come back in the fall, we begin to think in those terms, rather than think of people that need to come to us to discover us. Again, the whole notion of discovery, rather than us actually sending and putting education where is needed. And often we think of corporate relations as community relations. We need to separate between community engagement and relations versus engagement with corporation. Having a relation with Chevron is not a community relations, it's a corporate relations. So we need also to navigate our neoliberal structure of the university moving forward. So I don't want to take a lot of time. Let's have some few questions and then conclude the day on these notes. Thank you. Is there any questions? Are there?
So, yeah, feel free to submit your questions. We have some time for Q&A.
Yeah. One said, why was India not represented? Again, we called, we sent an email and a communication to ethnic studies faculty, and whoever responded, we put it in a 3-day tab of engagement. So it's not that we looked at territory, we invited everyone that came forth from the faculty. And this is actually, again, one step or one event to respond to events that are unfolding rather than to try to cover, because again, South Africa was not presented as a speaker, the Congo was not presented as a speaker, Bosnia, and so on. So we have many, or Rwanda and the genocide Rwanda. So again, it was not shaped around countries, it was shaped about which faculty responded with their availability. And hopefully that's something we would build on in the future. And this is not a defensive, it's just, we put a call and the people who responded to the call.
I have a quick question, maybe for Hatim and Harvey as well. So what do you, from your own experience, what do you think the way in which we could maybe radically reform our institution? I mean by that UC system and UC Berkeley in particular, in terms of engaging, allowing the engagement of particularly indigenous students, Black students, and other people of color students and low-income students. How we make that happen besides, I guess, tokenism? Like that's what we hear from the university over and over and over. But how we actually could facilitate this in your own experience?
Harvey, do you want to go from a long history, and I could jump in thereafter? Harvey, you need to put your unmute.
Well, when we first began the program, we had students at all levels, you know, in terms of decision making, and in terms of recruiting and the EOP program. So it's very well integrated, but I think you could say over time it's been institutionalized so that it's no longer like that, and you know, so it's much different. So one is how to get partnerships with community organizations to work with them in terms of recruiting and stuff like that, and also to maybe to have more students on recruiting committees, you know, to kind of choose like a good balance of students, you know, in terms of community focus, you know, that type of thing. Yeah.
Let me maybe begin with the following. The last time I did the data on UC Berkeley tenured faculty, it showed that 87% of tenured faculty at UC Berkeley are white. If you remove ethnic studies, the various ethnic studies departments, and EECS, electronic engineering, computer science, where we have a cluster of faculty of color, if you take those two units out, the percentage goes up to about 92, maybe to 93%. So I'm not a fan of the conversation of diversity and all this discourse, because it really does not touch on the fundamental pillars of how the institution is wired. And the commitment of resources is not there. You cannot bring an African-American student or minority student and just click the figure that we have one body in here. Because that one body that you brought, you have not thought about their social, economic conditions. You only are taking a number on your data rather than thinking broadly. I know that, again, from the African-American students, some minority students, I know they're working. I know some of them, they get the fellowship, at least on the graduate level, and they are paying the rent, helping their family with the rent. And they're engaged in maybe 2 or 3. And then the social environment is completely almost out of touch. So you assume that a student is going to be able to do X, Y, and Z because everybody is doing X, Y, and Z in our cohort. But coming, again, nothing against Moraga, Orinda, or San Ramon, or other places, that social, political, economic, cultural environment is not amenable to try to actually think of the students that you're bringing. So we have to actually speak of education within the framework of a social justice that attaches education and the institution to the economic, political structures that are out there, and think of it in that way. And I think what we're lacking today is both the courage, imagination, and the need to do different. If the university is committed to say, we want to increase as a strategic commitment to increase our African-American students by 10%, then it is up to all of us to figure out how to do it, rather than to try to actually put an office of diversity and inclusion, give them what you call 2 staff people, and send them out to hunt as if you're hunting what you call some unique specimen, rather than understanding that $1 million to actually change the needle on that, on inclusion of African-American students, is not going to do it. And you have to think broadly in relation to it. So these are the conversations that we need to have. And then the other thing is that also saying that I'm going to admit a student, let's say from Oakland, Pittsburgh, or Long Beach, and so on, and not thinking of why shouldn't we bring the university there? Some of our faculty of color are living in there. So on the one hand, we need to commute to the different parts of the university. On the other hand, also, we're not thinking that creating transformative education as a transformative social justice pillar. So these are some of the ideas that we need to really put on the table rather than play the what you call check the box. And you know, for anyone who worked on diversity issues, we actually are very skilled in clicking many boxes. And therefore you could actually inflate the many boxes. So all of a sudden you have 20% of your department are diverse, but it's actually through the many clicking of these boxes, which is structurally also very problematic within the institution. So that's at least some of the ideas in relations to the university. And I am still committed that affirmative action still need to be part and parcel of how we need to shift the data and the dynamics, and the removal of affirmative action beginning in '78 with the Bakke decision, but also Proposition 209 have crippled our ability to make actually measured and systematic change at the university level. It's a long answer, but it's needed. Okay, did we rescue few horses? I don't like to say, did we beat a dead horse? Because again, that language itself becomes militarized. So did we rescue a few horses at this time? So
I think that last question we really need to think it through, in terms of how are we gonna actually do that, you know, get more representation here at, well, in terms of ethnic studies or Berkeley in general, you know, what's, because it seems like it's a good opening now, you know, for moving on it, you know, because you have students that want change, and you have faculty here that want change, but it's like, what's the next step? So that is a good question, you know, because we did have experience in the past, but I think the experience in the past was because of the social movements, we actually had more power. But since then, we had less and less, you know, in terms of decision-making power, you know. So there is a change going on.
Well, and again, I think part of the making the university a neoliberal institution, privatizing parts of the university, the shifting of the burden, you know, in the early 80s, 85% of aid to the students was in grants. Now it's 85% in loan. So we have students that are indebted, that are working 2 or 3 jobs sometimes in the weekend there. So even the changing of the socio-political construct within the university have shifted dramatically. And then the university also became far more wedded to the military-industrial complex. We run the 2 major military labs, and now the whole push towards securitization study and security study, all these play a role in the type of academic, intellectual, as well as production that we see, and then how our students begin to actually also read the socio-economic landscape. So we have a lot of things that we need to think about, but I agree with you that we have a moment right now to put some of these ideas and begin to imagine and put some of those ideas into circulation for us to imagine and bring about a different university. Anyone else?
A question for,
by all means, yeah.
I do. I have a question for all the panelists, or whoever would like to answer. So what opportunities do you see presenting themselves at this critical moment for long-term change towards, whether that be healing for the Black community, decolonizing the mind, changing public discourse, and challenging structural racism and inequality in the United States? And this is open to anyone who would like to respond.
Any of the panelists, by all means, this is a conversation. It's, you know, I see some of the people still with us. So if you want to jump in, let's just have a free conversation.
I just wanted to, in relation to the last question about the 209 proposition, I wanted to alert everybody that there is an Assembly constitutional amendment, ACA 5, which is actually, which will allow California voters to repeal Proposition 209. So, you know, that is in the works. And I think it's something for us to work on concretely in terms of that particular issue.
Right.
If I could respond, one of the things that I'm hoping for to bring about change is increasing the conversation about mental health and mental wellness within communities of color, particularly as it relates to trauma. And the nexus between trauma and institutionalized racism is profound. Mental health itself still has a huge stigma on it within communities of color, within our society as a whole. And I feel like with what people are going through with COVID-19, as well as the pandemic with racism, people are having lots of mental health concerns that are coming up, and some aren't talking about them. So I'm hoping that with a lot of this that's happening, we take a look at how mental health really does impact every sector of our life. I'm thinking about students that I know of that are at Cal, that are students of color, who talk about the increased levels of depression because of isolation from their community, feeling not included and not represented in the classroom or in their lecture halls, that it does have a profound effect on people. So I'm hoping that we can have that continued dialogue in terms of how mental health and mental wellness really is a key point in our lives, and should be involved in all of the areas in terms of academia, within community settings, community activism, that we just don't leave it out as a sidebar conversation, but something that is really woven into our daily conversations about not just post-traumatic stress disorder, acute stress, all these aspects, and the profound impact that, like I said before, institutionalized racism has on how we function. And the last piece, in terms of how mental health also impacts the social determinants of health and wellness, and impacts all of that. And so really, I'm hoping that with many of the things that are unfolding, that those conversations will continue, will flourish, and will move outside of the mental health world into our general population.
Anyone else?
If I may, very quickly, Basim. So in relation to the question you posed, I think a lot of there is tactical and there is a strategical way to think about this. I've been thinking a lot in terms of where I come from the Othering and Belonging Institute, that we always thinking and calling for transformative change. But we think till that happen, without changing the structure for that to happen, you know, the way in which we think about multiple issues, some other smaller but are important issues are not going to be solved. What I mean by that, for example, you know, if I want to think about social determinant to health, can I think of that without thinking about the way in which we design our cities, or without we think about education or transportation system or the living wages? So we often say that we should think about a larger issue to transform the society, and we try to go after that issue from policy perspective, but also from allowing the community to have access to tools and to resources to push further through electoral processes, in order, even if we fail in that particular issue, but we open up other possibilities. But often what we see in today's societies, we go after remedies that are symptomatic to the issues, and we really spend so much energy and resources, but yet even when we get it, we don't get anything done. An example, case in point, is, for example, police reform. You know, like, we've been doing that for, I don't know, for the last at least 50 years, as of my own recollections, where we get nowhere, because it's still we're looking at it from very symptomatic areas. Apologies, I dropped my mic. And also in higher education and representation and including of people low-income people of color. I mean, it's not going to happen. I agree with Hatim what he said, but if the society itself doesn't challenge the way in which we are complicit as a whole, I'm not talking about a particular group of people, that if we don't engage with the issues, I mean, I don't know why we blame people in power and the elite class. Of course, the elite always has their goal, they are very specific, but how we can engage with the civic citizen and civic engagement to challenge and change the thing that we see is not in our favor. So that, in my opinion, required a completely different sophisticated social movement to push through from local to global. Not because, yes, I hear people say all politics are local. I'm not quite sure if I agree with that, because most of other policy are not local, because the decision is not in a local spaces. You can't hold the police accountable in Berkeley unless you have a good legislation in Congress or the federal government, and not adhere to international obligation to preserve the life and dignity for all people. So sometimes we need to figure out a way in which to harness the energy and to think about what are the biggest issue we could actually interject, even if we fail, but by failing, we're reorganizing the way in which we want to see our society. There is no magic bullet. I don't have a magical solution. Your question is very profound and big, but I think we have to start from the imminent. And I will end with that. At the same time, while we're working in strategies, we have to look at the tactical preserving, protecting lives of people suffering right now. So I agree with the previous speaker. We have to think about complex trauma and how we deal with that. Like we can't say, oh, that should be strategical. We leave it in 100 years from now. That cannot be wait. Issues of protecting Black lives, that has to be an immediate response. So between the tactical and the strategic, as the people who work in public policy, we have to think what the tactical that we could do, open up the space for the strategic position, and how we relay this information and equip the public with it, engage with our citizens, and be bridging that misunderstanding and mistrust, and to build the power of communities and the power of citizenry engaged people.
And we'll take the last comments. I don't want to keep you away from dinner. Any other comments? So maybe we'll conclude. So really thanks you all for enriching our conversation, for bringing all types of issues to the table. I take it as a first step, and we're definitely gonna try to work on getting the full semester as we come in with ideas and plans. It's a moment, and what we need is to imagine the world that we want to see and go out and make it happen. I always say, if you can't think it, you can't actualize it. So the first is that you have to think of what you want in the world. And then the next step is to go out and actualize it. And then the second part is don't accept to be a therapist to power, because they always tell you, I don't know how to do it. Can you help me? I said, well, that's not my role. You often, if you find enough money to spend $7 trillion on foreign wars, and also to build stadiums that only are used for 6 days, I'm definitely sure that you'll be able, creative enough to make the changes that are needed. So let's go out and do the changes. And thank you all. May God bless you and protect your family and give you good health in these difficult times. Goodbye.
Thank you, Hatim.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.